year, and I assure you we would not have gotten this document out when we did without her keeping track of all the deadlines and the due dates and setting up meetings and keeping us on track. So special thanks to Laurel. I also want to recognize Frank Roddy and Tim O'Brien, who have since retired at the end of last year, and Ide Ortiz, who did a lot of work on the administrative draft and the workshops that we did. Next slide, please. So winemaking is vital to California's economy and generates an estimated $57.6 billion in annual economic impact through tax revenue, wages, tourism, and sales, and creates about 325,000 jobs in California. Winemaking also generates processed water with the potential to degrade groundwater depending on winery-specific activities, the size of the winery, and their treatment processes. Next slide, please. This processed water is generated during production or crush and juice extraction activities and cleaning operations like sanitation of equipment, tanks, and barrels. Crush is a key step in production and typically occurs from mid-August to early November for about 45 to 75 days, though this varies by winery and location. Some wineries operate year-round, generating processed water from blending, bottling, and cleaning operations. Processed water quality varies depending on the source water quality, the facility operations, and the type of cleaning chemicals utilized. Water quality and volume also vary seasonally, with the highest flows and highest constituent concentrations generated during crush when the grapes are harvested and pressed. Processed water contains a range of constituents, but the ones of most concern that we address in the order are nitrogen, biochemical oxygen demand, and salinity. Next slide, please. The Wine Institute, which represents over 1,000 wineries in California, estimates that there are about 3,900 bonded wineries in California. They also estimate that about 2,100 of these wineries would be subject to regulation under the order. The other 1,800 are expected to either be in the de minimis category, they discharge to a community sewer system, or they utilize a tank and haul system where processed water is containerized and disposed of off-site. Looking at this map, you can see that California wineries are widespread, but primarily located within the boundaries of the North Coast region, San Francisco Bay, Central Coast, Los Angeles, Santa Ana, San Diego, and Central Valley water boards. Next slide, please. Water board staff estimate that about 570 wineries are currently permitted through a general order, conditional waiver, or an individual regional water board order. This is about 27% of the estimated 2,100 wineries expected to need coverage under the general order. Please note that the San Francisco Bay numbers in the graphic are lower than would be expected because wineries in Napa County are currently permitted through their local oversight program, and development of a region-wide order in the San Francisco Bay was put on hold in anticipation of this statewide order. It's our expectation that the statewide order will increase environmental compliance and permitting consistency for wineries in the state. And I would point out on the table that most of the facilities that are regulated are in the Central Coast region. They have a waste discharge requirement which contains a conditional waiver, and most of those on the table are in their conditional waiver category. Next slide, please. So this project began in about roughly 2015 when I had my picture made, and we have engaged the regional water boards and stakeholders along the way. The timeline shows key milestones in the schedule leading up to the potential consideration by the board. We started in February 2019 last year. We released an administrative draft of the general order to engage stakeholders and the public. From April to August of last year, staff held 5 workshops in Hopland, Lodi, Napa, San Luis Obispo, and Temecula. Additionally, staff have held numerous working meetings with regional water board program staff and wine industry representatives. We received input from related water board program staff, including the Office of Enforcement, the Recycle Water Program, and the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program. We consulted with the Department of Food and Agriculture, and we completed tribal consultations in accordance with Assembly Bill 52. In addition, we met with representatives from California Coastkeeper, Los Angeles Waterkeeper, and Roshan Riverkeeper. Staff considered comments from these entities to propose the draft general order that is currently available for public comment. Today, we're here to provide additional information on the draft order, answer questions, and get feedback from the public. As a reminder, the written comments are due on August 5th at noon. We welcome comments and the opportunity to discuss concerns on these proposed requirements. Next slide, please. And now I'll turn it over to Melissa Gunter with the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Board.
Thank you, Scott. Good morning, board members. This slide depicts a brief layout of the main components of the general order. So the general order includes findings that provide project background and regulatory context of the order. And the hereby ordered section addresses the order requirements, followed by supporting attachments such as the monitoring and reporting program. So we don't intend to go through all the requirements and provisions today, but do plan to cover the important parts and the recent changes since the release of the 2019 administrative draft. Specifically, in the findings, there's a process to include sustainability programs that have provisions to manage salt and nutrients. Wineries enrolled in an approved sustainability program may receive a reduced annual fee and can use the practices in this sustainability program for compliance instead of the facility's specific plans required by this order. Additionally, this general order incorporates provisions of the Central Valley Salinity Alternatives for Long-Term Sustainability, referenced as CV salts, as an alternative compliance mechanism for dischargers located in the Central Valley region. The general order also includes the option for regional water boards to approve salt and nutrient management plans instead of individual plans as a mean for compliance. Next slide. The general order proposed this tier structure based on the volume of winery process water in gallons per year. So as displayed on the table, the winery classification tier is listed on the left from de minimis to tier 4. And in the center column are the ranges of the total annual winery process water volume per tier. And then to help visualize the volume of the process water, the right column generally relates the number of backyard swimming pools, similar to the one in the upper right corner, to the volume of process water range of each of the tiers. So the volume threshold for de minimis wineries, which are not required to enroll, are proposed as wineries discharging processed water less than 10,000 gallons per year. Although the de minimis wineries are not required to enroll, if a regional water board determines that a high density of wineries in an area results in a higher threat to water quality, enrollment into Tier 1 may be required. De minimis wineries may be required to register electronically upon direction by the state or the regional water board. The Tier 1 wineries discharge up to 100,000 gallons per year, and the Tier 2 are up to 300,000 gallons per year, whereas Tier 3's maximum amount of processed water is 1 million gallons per year. And Tier 4 wineries are classified as wineries discharging greater than 1 million gallons per year. Next slide. The general order is intended to be the primary permitting mechanism for wineries in the state, although we recognize that not all wineries will be eligible for coverage under the general order. So dischargers covered by individual or general waste discharge requirements or a conditional waiver of waste discharge requirements may continue discharging under that authority until those orders expire or come up for renewal. And at that time or earlier at the discretion of the regional water board, they will notify the winery to initiate the enrollment process under the general order. However, the regional board has the authority to direct a winery to obtain or keep coverage under the individual waste discharge requirements if that would be more protective of water quality based on site-specific conditions. And then coverage under the general order does require submitting a complete notice of intent, which is an attachment of the general order, with a supporting technical report and along with associated filing fee. So the submitted materials will be reviewed by the regional water board or local agency program administrator. And then following review and approval, a notice of applicability confirming enrollment under the general order will be issued. So now I will turn it over to our senior project manager, Laurel Wardrop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and good morning, everyone. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. The proposed order also includes discharge prohibitions that apply to all tiers and treatment systems. Some prohibition examples include the discharge of hazardous or designated waste, high strength or high salinity waste, stillage or distillery waste, and discharge of waste to surface waters. The order requires dischargers to also ensure all conveyance, treatment, storage, and disposal systems are designed to prevent inundation or washout due to floods with a 100-year return frequency. Manage stormwater that has contacted winery waste, process equipment, or processing areas as processed water. Adhere to minimum setbacks for waste discharges from water supply wells at 100 feet, surface water drainages at 100 feet, and property lines at 50 feet. Implement standard practices for mosquito and abatement and for the application of herbicides or pesticides, and implement salinity source control and reduction measures. Next slide. And you can read the definition on the slide as well. The fixed dissolved solids or FDS threshold for salinity applies to all tiers and treatment systems. A winery is required to take measurements of the winery effluent to assess if the threshold has been met. If the FDS threshold has not been met, the discharger is required to ensure effective salt control practices are implemented at the facility and notify the regional water board. Tier 1 or 2 dischargers must submit a salt control plan if directed by the regional water board. And Tier 3 or 4 dischargers are required to submit a salt control plan. Please note that salt control plans require preparation by or under the supervision of a California registered civil engineer. The regional water board can approve alternates to the salt control plan through a board-approved sustainability program or an approved salt nutrient management plan. Next slide, please. This slide just shows a hypothetical example of a winery process water treatment system layout, and the examples show here the ponds, land application areas, and subsurface disposal systems, which are regulated in this order, and kind of how they work together. However, wineries may use all or a subset of these systems to manage their process water discharges to land. The next few slides go through the proposed order requirements by treatment system and tier for existing, new, or expanded wineries. Next slide. We'll start with ponds. The general specifications for all tiers with ponds include requirements for berm and levee design and construction, the pond base to be at least 5 feet above the seasonal high water table, pond freeboard, dissolved oxygen concentration to control odors, pond liner design, and design capacity. Dischargers are required to report the pond capacity and hydraulic conductivity information in the notice of intent and technical report. For existing ponds, the submittal for regional water board approval is required within 1 year of receiving a notice of applicability. For newer expanding ponds, this information is required at least 120 days prior to the start of construction. Next slide. For Tier 1 dischargers with existing lined or on-line ponds, they're required to meet the general pond specifications from the last slides, report the pond's existing characteristics for capacity and hydraulic conductivity, and if required by the regional water board, meet the order's pond storm design and hydraulic conductivity standards that I'll show in the next slides. Next slide, please. Tier 2 dischargers with existing lined or online ponds must comply with the Tier 1 requirements, plus the pond storm design standard, set at 100-year 24-hour storm sizing, or a regional water board approved alternate down to the 25-year 24-hour sizing. Dischargers can demonstrate they meet the hydraulic conductivity standard of 1 × 10⁻⁶ centimeters per second by providing one of the following: providing documentation for line ponds less than 10 years old, conducting initial pond performance testing, or demonstrating compliance through 5 years of groundwater monitoring data. The required ongoing performance testing begins 5 years after the notice of applicability is issued. Next slide. We'll move on to Tier 3 or 4, dischargers with existing lined or online ponds. These dischargers must comply with the Tier 2 requirements, plus for Tier 3, groundwater monitoring is required if directed by the Regional Water Board where site-specific conditions indicate a threat to water quality. For Tier 4, groundwater monitoring is required. Next slide. Okay, we're now switching to new or expanding ponds, so just a few more slides on ponds. Tier 1 dischargers are required to meet the general pond specifications, meet the storm sizing of the 100-year 24-hour or down to the 25-year 24-hour sizing, and meet the hydraulic conductivity standard of 1 × 10⁻⁶ centimeters per second. Next slide, please. For Tier 2 dischargers with new or expanding ponds, the Tier 1 requirements apply, plus ongoing performance testing beginning 5 years after the notice of applicability is issued. Next slide. Tier 3 or 4 dischargers with new or expanding ponds must comply with the Tier 2 requirements, plus for Tier 3, groundwater monitoring is required if directed by the Regional Water Board where site-specific conditions indicate a threat to water quality. And for Tier 4, groundwater monitoring is required. Next slide, please. Okay, we are now going to switch to the land application area requirements, and the following specifications apply to all the tiers. Application of waste constituents to land must be at agronomic rates on an annual basis defined in the order as follows. The rate of nutrient application in amounts no more than necessary to satisfy a plant's nutrient demand, sometimes termed crop uptake, considering the crop, soil, climate, irrigation method and efficiency, and leaching fraction, thus minimizing the movement of nutrients below the plant root zone. Please note this accounts for nutrient loading from all sources, which could be processed water, processed solids, compost, fertilizers, and other soil amendments. Nitrogen application rates for crops being irrigated on the land application area must not exceed the highest crop uptake value from the specified published references in the order. If none of the sources include crop uptake values for the crop being irrigated, the discharger must propose a site-specific crop uptake value for Regional Water Board approval. Examples of this would be using crop tissue samples or other published references. Other general specifications for land application areas include the following. Water must be distributed uniformly, considering the site and area conditions. Processed water must be applied when ground is unsaturated, no rainfall is forecasted, and in a manner where it will infiltrate within 48 hours. Processed irrigation water must be contained and not run off the property or into any surface water or drainage. Processed water cannot be stored in low pressure or unpressurized pipelines or ditches. Next slide. Okay, for Tier 1 or 2 dischargers with land application areas, they must meet the general land application area specifications we just discussed, and in addition, comply with the biochemical oxygen demand or BOD average loading limit of 100 pounds per acre per day over an irrigation cycle, which is a cycle made up of irrigation days and the subsequent drying days, and comply with the instantaneous day of application BOD loading limit of 300 pounds per acre per day. These loading rates are calculated using the applied volume of processed water, applied acreage, and the average of the 3 most recent results of processed water BOD. Next slide. Tier 3 or 4 dischargers with land application areas must comply with the Tier 2 requirements, plus for Tier 3, groundwater monitoring is required if directed by the Regional Water Board when site-specific conditions indicate a threat to water quality. For Tier 4, groundwater monitoring is required. Also, any dischargers with groundwater monitoring data demonstrating impacts to water quality may be required at a minimum by the Regional Water Board to develop and implement a site-specific nitrogen control plan, comply with a Regional Water Board accepted salt nutrient management plan, or implement a sustainability program with nitrogen controls. Next slide. Okay, we're now going to switch to the subsurface disposal system specifications, which are also included in the order. The general specifications apply to any discharger in any tier with a new or expanding subsurface disposal system or existing system, such as daily discharge flow to the subsurface disposal area will not exceed 1 gallon per square foot of discharge trench per day. System maintenance, control of solids and settling tank servicing requirements are in the general specifications, and the ability to replace 100% of the system, also termed 100% redundancy. It must have at least 5 foot separation from the seasonal high water table. Also, for a subsurface disposal system in any tier, the Regional Water Board can approve alternates to a required nitrogen control plan through a board-approved sustainability program or an approved salt and nutrient management plan. And I'll go over those control plans in the next few slides. Next slide, please. Tier 1 dischargers with existing, new, or expanding subsurface disposal systems are required to meet the hydraulic loading limits and general specifications from the last slide. Next slide. Tier 2 dischargers with existing, new, or expanding systems must comply with the Tier 1 requirements, plus the treated subsurface disposal system effluent must be monitored and measured weekly before discharging to the subsurface disposal area, and meet the effluent limits for total nitrogen at 10 milligrams per liter, BOD at 300 milligrams per liter, and total suspended solids at 330 milligrams per liter. For Tier 2 effluent limit exceedances for newer expanding systems, the discharger must submit a nitrogen control plan if nitrogen is exceeded for 3 consecutive samples. For an existing system, the discharger must submit a nitrogen control plan if the nitrogen limit is exceeded for 3 consecutive samples, and the Regional Water Board directs them to submit the plan where site-specific conditions have indicated a threat to water quality. Next slide. For Tier 3 or 4 dischargers with existing, new, or expanding systems, the Tier 2 requirements apply, plus for Tier 3 effluent limit exceedances, when the Regional Water Board requires the submittal of a nitrogen control plan, the discharger would submit the plan. For Tier 4 effluent limit exceedances, the discharger must submit a nitrogen control plan. In addition, conduct groundwater monitoring. And I should note, for Tier 3, the Regional Board can also direct groundwater monitoring to be conducted. That concludes my presentation on the systems, and I'll turn it over to the lead engineer, Jennifer Chen. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurel. So I'm going to give an overview of the monitoring and reporting program. Oh, thank you. Or MRP in the order. So the order has what we call a model monitoring program, which has all the components needed to comply with the order. However, every site is different, and all these pieces may not apply to your specific site. So for example, you may or may not have a pond, maybe you land apply, but you don't do subsurface disposal. Also, some regions may actually add region-specific monitoring requirements. That, for example, may be based on their basin plan or other region-specific policies. So when you submit your technical report with your application, the Regional Board will take that information, tailor the model monitoring program into a site-specific one, that will then be issued with your notice of applicability. The order requires monitoring reports. So all sites have to do compliance letters and annual reports. The compliance letter is only submitted for months where there is a violation. So in it, you'll describe what happened and the corrective measures that were taken to address that violation. The compliance letter also serves as the transmittal letter for all the monitoring reports. There's also semi-annual reports, which are submitted twice a year, and quarterly reports, which are submitted 4 times a year, but they're only for groundwater monitoring. So the semi-annual report may apply to Tier 3, and the quarterly reports will apply to all Tier 4. The last groundwater monitoring report of the year can be either submitted as a standalone report or it can be incorporated into the annual report. So you would have one less standalone report. Next slide, please. The monitoring in the order is tied to compliance points to show you're meeting the requirements. These include tier determination and FTS threshold, which share the same compliance point. There's also pond monitoring for things like freeboard and DO, dissolved oxygen. For the land application, we want to know what's going to the land. So there's monitoring for the processed water volume, water quality, tracking which fields receive water, and also any other sources of nutrients like nitrogen that may be applied to the fields, like fertilizer, processed solids, soil amendments. Similarly, for the subsurface disposal, we also want to know what's going to the subsurface disposal area. So here there's also monitoring for the treated effluent water quality, the processed water volume, and also the subsections that receive processed water. So all tiers are required to monitor the site's source water and winery effluent. The winery effluent is the compliance point for both tier determination and FTS threshold. We want to capture how much processed water is generated at the facility, including any outdoor processing areas, and that will determine your tier. When you compare the FTS concentration at that compliance point with the source water, we can then see how much salinity was added from just the processing activities. The remaining monitoring depends on what you have at your site. So for example, if you have ponds, you land apply, you discharge the subsurface system, you have groundwater monitoring, you'll only have to monitor for those pieces that apply to your site. So again, those will be shown in your site-specific monitoring program. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. The order also contains additional requirements for solids, groundwater, and technical reporting. It also has standard requirements, such as the general ones like signing authority that are found in all WDR orders. The solid specifications are to control and contain processed solids and any leachate that forms. So that leachate or the liquid from the solids must be managed as processed water. The groundwater limitations require compliance with the basin plan and to protect the beneficial uses of groundwater. The technical provisions have reporting and facility requirements for system upgrades and other changes. So for here, it's important to keep in mind that not all of the technical provisions will apply to your site. It's also important to note that there are compliance timeframes for each of these items. Next slide, please. So with that, this concludes our staff presentation. On behalf of the project team, I want to thank you all again for your time today, and I'll now hand it back to the board members. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that as Mr. Couch had indicated, this has been a long effort coming, and I know that there's continued need for balancing on the approach. I really appreciate the good work that has gone in, particularly these last months, I know, to try to get things to a point here. And I really appreciate, again, the proposal and the work that's gone on so far. I don't have any immediate questions, but would ask my fellow board members if they have any comment or question before we move into hearing public comment. Hearing none, I think we can start to make our way through the public comment speaker cards.
So Chair Esquivel, we do actually have two panels that we're going to proceed at the beginning.
Okay.
The first will be Ms. Creamers, Noelle Creamers, and she has three individuals who will go with her. We're going to be pulling up a PowerPoint presentation, and Ms. Creamers will be asking you to start your video and unmute your microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Loffer. Good morning, Ms. Creamers.
Morning, Chair Esquivel and members. Okay, wonderful. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak this morning and provide an overview of California's wine industry and some specific thoughts on what's included in the general order. Next slide, please. Thank you. I want to provide an overview of wineries. And I know these numbers are slightly different than what Mr. Couch presented. And I think that difference comes from there are some facilities that have multiple wineries at the same facility. And so I counted individual facilities rather than wineries. But there's approximately 3,600 wineries in California. About 2,100 wineries are subject to the WDR. And it is important to recognize, and I appreciate staff's recognition of the value, the economic value that the wine industry provides to California. But the employment figures that are tossed out in the 325,000 range, that includes employment at wineries, employment at wholesalers, so the distributors, retailers, and winery connected tourism. So the number of employees that are actually at wineries are approximately 36,000. And unfortunately, given the recent economic downturn and pandemic, there's even fewer today because of layoffs. That works out to an average number of employees at each winery of 10. But then we also obviously have some very large companies with their own wineries. And so if you remove the wine companies and just average after that, you get an average of 5 employees at those wineries. And many of those, so those 5 employees would include a bookkeeper, someone in the tasting room. And so you probably only have 3 employees who are doing the winemaking and would also then be tasked with all of the monitoring and reporting and compliance under this order. So I just want to make sure that folks have an understanding of the reality out there in the industry of how this will be implemented. Next slide, please. Now, we're all clear on the economic situation that we're in right now. It is estimated that U.S. wine losses could reach nearly $6 billion because of COVID-19. 97% of U.S. wineries, and California makes 81% of U.S. wine, produce less than 50,000 cases annually. And a 50,000 case winery, that's about 600,000 gallons of wastewater annually. Those wineries are expected to see revenue losses between 36 and 66%. I'm guessing many people saw at the beginning of the pandemic a lot of newspaper articles and media reports about the increase in alcohol consumption and purchases. Those were all like grocery store purchases. However, we saw a drastic decline in sales at wineries themselves and at restaurants. So it's important to recognize that particularly small wineries are being significantly impacted by the pandemic. And that's important to note because I don't expect that you'll hear from a lot of small wineries who will have significant costs due to this order today, because right now they are focusing solely on keeping their businesses intact. They were their tasting rooms were shut down for 3 months. As of last week, they're required, if they want to keep operating, to move all tasting outside. They're now gearing up for harvest and trying to figure out how they're going to harvest and keep their employees safe from contributing to the spread of COVID-19. So that right now is everyone's focus. They don't have the time to really dig deep into understanding what's included in the order. Now, you may laugh when you see my elements that require changes, and it's pretty much everything. But I do want to really express appreciation to the staff. There have been changes in this draft that it's clear that they listened to earlier concerns that we expressed. One of them is switching from a case-based tiering system to an actual process water-based system. We appreciate that. But there's still a lot of discussion that needs to happen to make this order focus on addressing water quality and be workable for wineries. I don't want to get into the specifics because it's very technical, but we really just want to have that time to have those conversations and figure out those solutions moving forward. It's also important that in the staff's presentation, there was information on the number of wineries that are under a general order currently. in their regions. And it would be really important to use the data that was gathered from those WDRs to identify if there are problems. And then we can focus our efforts on solving those problems rather than having a blanket approach that covers everyone where there may or may not be problems in existence. I do want to talk specifically about the monitoring and reporting piece. There are some redundant monitoring requirements included. So for example, the order requires that ponds be lined, then it also requires leak testing, and then also for the larger wineries, groundwater monitoring. But if you're lining your pond and ensuring that it's not leaking, it doesn't seem like you then need to take the next step to do groundwater monitoring. So it's things like that that we'd like to work through. It's also important to recognize the capacity of ELAP certified labs. I mean, we're all hearing about the inability to get COVID testing results back in a timely fashion. I have an acquaintance who spent 14 days. Oh, thank you for switching. Next slide, sorry. Next slide. I have an acquaintance who it took 14 days to get her COVID test results back. And it is likely, given all the monitoring that's required, that we will see similar challenges in the ELAP certified labs for these testing. And this could be particularly problematic when, like in the BOD requirements of the lab. It's also important to recognize the cost of all this monitoring. There are many areas where weekly monitoring is required, and it's estimated that annual costs could range from $17,000 to $44,000, depending on the system that you use and the size of the winery. But Kim Stemler later on the panel will discuss the costs in further detail. Next slide, please. I want to talk about groundwater monitoring specifically as well. There's significant data available currently through the groundwater information system. And so if you look here, you can look at the Alexander Valley and the Napa Valley, where wineries have been the longest, and it does not appear that there's a nitrate problem. Now, if you look at Salinas Valley, there's obviously a lot of existing data available on the wells, but clearly there's a nitrate issue in the Central Coast, and there are ongoing efforts to address this. More is needed, but this is going on. You may hear later from others about the nitrate issue on the Central Coast, and you may hear reference to wells that have had past readings of up to 3,000 for nitrates. And we found one well that has had past readings of 3,000. That well's in Guadalupe, but it's nowhere near a winery. So we also think that we should look at where the problems are, but also the cause of the problem. And if wineries aren't contributing to it, it's challenging for us to make investments, because if we weren't causing the problem, changes at the winery won't make improvements. We just think that there really should be a targeted approach on groundwater wells, and you should look at the specific risks. I had some members provide me with information on the amount of nitrates and nitrogen in their effluent levels. And some of them are in their effluent, nitrate is non-detectable. And so if that's the case, that may be a situation where it isn't justified to have groundwater monitoring. Next slide, please. So there are many solutions possible that will create an order that works for wineries and is protective of water quality. And we really look forward to continuing to work with you and with staff to help us come to a solution that works for everyone, so that we can come to you in November with an order that we all view as a success. Thank you.
And then Noelle, who is going to go next in your panel?
Ashley Egelhoff will be next.
Okay, good morning. My name is Ashley. I'm the assistant winemaker at Honig Vineyard and Winery in Napa. Honig is a medium-sized, family-owned and operated winery. We produce just over 1 million gallons of processed water, which would classify us as a Tier 4 discharger on the very low end. Honig has 24 employees on site, 11 of which work in production. There's no dedicated compliance person here. It's not really something that works for our size and structure. And as such, the compliance of this order will fall into the responsibilities of the winemaking team, which includes myself and our winemaker. This will be the case for many independently owned wineries, especially as you move down the tier levels. Employees often wear multiple hats and tasks are shuffled around as best as possible. The time and effort that will be required for wineries to comply with the monitoring and reporting aspect of this WDR is going to be intensive. The monetary resources required for monitoring and reporting are also extensive. In doing some rough calculations based on the cost of water samples we've performed in the last calendar year, the cost of testing alone for us to comply with the order will be between $17,000 and $20,000 annually. We have a septic system with a subsurface disposal system. I spoke with another medium-sized, independently owned Napa winery that has a pond and limited land discharge, and their costs would be somewhere between $18,000 and $20,000 annually. Another winery I spoke to in Sonoma that would be classified as a tier 2 winery would spend approximately $7,000 to $10,000 annually. These costs don't include annual fees, costs to upgrade systems to comply, the potential cost of consultants, and so on. I'd like to urge the board to consider the impact of this order as written, that it will have on labor, time, and economic resources available to all wineries, but especially to those that are smaller, independently operated businesses, which do make up the majority of California wineries, particularly in light of the current economic climate. I think Jessica is next.
Much appreciated.
Good
Ms.
morning.
Meyer, are you next? Yes.
I am. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Jessica Meyer, representing St. Michelle Wine Estates today. And we thoroughly reviewed the WDRs, or the order, and we just wanted to present the following comments. Number one, the order as proposed, we feel will cause unreasonable financial burden to tier 4 wineries. As proposed, the order requires wineries to submit numerous technical plans and reports, many of them requiring preparation by a California registered civil engineer. We located 12 technical reports within the WDRs, including a salt control plan, a nitrogen control plan, a salt and nutrient management plan, pond capacity technical report, pond performance technical report, pond hydraulic conductivity technical report, spill prevention and emergency response plan, monitoring well installation work plan, soil sampling plan, groundwater sampling and analysis plan, monitoring well installation report, and erosion control plan. In addition, wineries must have a written operations manual containing SOPs for each operation that produces wastewater, as well as an SOP for the operation of the wastewater system. As proposed, the WDRs will require wineries to increase monitoring substantially. For example, a tier 4 winery that has both a pond and land application, it is required that they take 16 analytical samples per week, with additional costs for manpower to extract the samples, perform the field analysis, and transport the samples to the lab every single week. The WDRs will also require significant capital projects for some tier 4 wineries, including pond liner installations, redesigning, expanding ponds, relocating ponds, redesigning and expanding subsurface disposal systems, installation of groundwater monitoring wells, and construction of a pumice containment area. As proposed, the order will also cause further groundwater depletion. General specification C1K prohibits discharging waste within 100 feet of any water supply well, 100 feet of surface waters and drainage courses, and within 50 feet of the property line. The setbacks for discharge will greatly reduce the area available for land application, as vineyards commonly extend to within 50 feet of a property line. Redesigning and reconstructing a dual vineyard irrigation system to allow for the vines that fall within the 50-foot zone to receive only fresh water is not economically feasible, and vineyards will choose to apply groundwater to the entire block instead of beneficially reusing the wastewater. Restricting and prohibiting land application on areas requiring water will increase the extraction of groundwater to ensure crops are receiving an adequate supply of water. We propose the board review and reduce the financial burden on industry through reduction of technical reports, plans, and monitoring required, and reduction of capital costs associated with these WDRs. We also propose the board review and document groundwater depletion in the CEQA initial study due to the loss of beneficial reuse of the wastewater through the reduction of land application area. And that is all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Meyer. Really appreciate the comments and feedback here. Is there another member still on your panel? Hello, Ms. Stemler. Yeah, you should be in a moment given the opportunity to unmute. One moment.
Okay, good.
Good morning, Ms. Stemler.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you all for your dedication to this work. So I'm Kim Stemler. I'm the director of the Monterey County Vintners and Growers Association. And a little bit about Monterey County. We cultivate about 44,000 acres of wine grapes, which is pretty close to what Napa cultivates as well. We only have 72 operating bonded wineries, which is significantly less than Napa would have. And Monterey County growers and winemakers are stewards of our land, our community, and our employees. Many went to kindergarten together, so they are accountable to their neighbors and have very close relationships with our neighbors. So as presented, the proposed requirements for monitoring wastewater discharge creates an unreasonable financial burden on wineries. And the question is this the best way to monitor wastewater discharge? And if it will result in significantly different information than the current monitoring that's happening now on the Central Coast? So there are three buckets of cost: the direct testing and monitoring cost, the employee time associated cost, and then consultant fees. So the direct testing and monitoring costs are estimated to be between $17,000 and $44,000 per year. And those costs include monitoring of source water, winery effluent pond, land application area and the effluent 2, subsurface disposal area and the effluent 2, solids, groundwater, and the reporting cost. Tier 2 wineries actually only have about 6 to 7 employees in the winery production side. So I think we'd often think of them as big businesses, but in reality, they're really small businesses. They're not large enough to have a compliance department. So it's going to be one of the people in the winery, one of the winemakers doing this compliance. And the employee that's going to be required to do this is going to need special skills. So they are a higher level of compensation than, they will require a higher level of compensation than the normal winery production worker. So wineries estimate that this level of monitoring would take approximately 1/4 to 1/3 FTE a year. And if we translate that into cost, that correlates to about 3.5 to 7% of Tier 2's total cost for wages, or between $21,000 to $35,000 a year. And that's only for monitoring. That's not for any kind of corrective action. So then, because of the complexity, we anticipate the wineries will need to engage an expert consultant. And that we anticipate to cost between $20,000 to $40,000 a year. So in summary, the total cost includes $17,000 to $44,000 for testing and monitoring, $21,000 to $35,000 for wages, and $20,000 to $40,000 per year for consultants. So the annual cost of testing and monitoring, and again, only testing and monitoring for a Tier 2 winery in Monterey County would be between $58,000 to $119,000 per year. These are small businesses. So the recommended monitoring protocols obviously cause an excessive and undue burden on these businesses. And again, it's unclear if it would really result in any different results than we are already doing. So, and my pitch to all regulatory bodies is thank you for all you're doing. And as a regulatory body, we ask that you coordinate your activities with all other regulatory bodies to streamline and increase the effectiveness and efficiency of all regulations. It is very complex to do business. in this state, in this country, and often things don't coordinate very well. And further, ensure that the cost and monitoring justify the benefits of the regulation are grounded in the specific data you've already collected about whatever kind of effects are occurring now as a result of wineries. So again, thank you very much, and we look forward to working together.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stemler. And I appreciate the panel perspective here and some of the points that were made. I'll just flag for now that I will be interested. I think we all as a board are continually interested in making sure we do understand the costs associated here. I know there were a number of facts and figures that were generated, it sounds like, from the individual wineries here. It'd be great to make sure those are conferred with what our staff are understanding of the various costs, so that we do get together a really good and strong understanding of the economic costs associated with the regulations here, but also the benefit. And for us, it's not a cost benefit analysis ultimately that we do in this context, but it is incredibly important for us as a board to understand what are the impacts, what are the costs that will be passed down associated with this program, and ensure that we're able to weigh those amongst it. So just a flag for staff more than anything as well, and just thank you all for the numbers and the engagement, and certainly the acknowledge the sensitivity, and want to make sure we drill down and have then those best numbers around what these potential impacts are to folks. My only question would be, I imagine there is some testing that you do now, so it's not really starting from zero perhaps, but I would hope there's maybe some regime that you are already somewhat engaged in. So just flag for that as a point generally. But thank you. I really appreciate again the comment. We have
Joaquin, excuse me, sorry, if I could ask a quick question.
Board Member McGuire, yes, of course.
While hopefully she's still on. So I share the concerns about the costs, and I look forward to more discussion about that. But while she's here, I was wondering, because I understand that the Central Coast Regional Board already has a looks like fairly comprehensive WDR, and so I was wondering what the current costs are, and what how much of an additional burden you're estimating this to cause, if you have that information available at this point.
I see Ms. Creamer's here. I don't know if you would like to maybe try to respond for Ms. Stemler. We'll see. We should be able to get her back here. We'll have Ms. Townsend or Mr. Lawfer. But
yeah, I think
Ms. Creamer.
Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead, Kim. You know what? That is a great. I don't know that, and I will find that out, because that's really important to know. So how is it different than what we're doing right now? So I will commit to you to find that out and get that information to you.
Great. Thanks so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I also had a question just to drill down a little more on the panelists in general. So I don't know, which one wants to answer this, but or multiple ones. So on the monitoring costs and needs, I heard a little bit from Ms. Kramer's about thinking through making sure that we're not requiring monitoring if there's not those constituents of any significant level in the discharge. Certainly that makes sense to not to reduce I guess my understanding is we need to understand what's in the discharge. We need to understand current conditions of the receiving water or groundwater, but then the ongoing monitoring costs should be tailored to that risk, and the data on what's in what constituents are in the wastewater, and be able to think through or understand the risk of that to not just sort of what's deep in the aquifer, because that's always going to be delayed from current discharges, but also just what the, more importantly, what the potential impacts are to groundwater from from current discharges, or the contributions to existing problems. So I guess my question is, what are the parts, I think what I heard was the monitoring and reporting requirements in this are excessive, very costly, and there's ways to tailor them more to the particular risks that this could have impact. So can you just talk a little bit more about where that, like specifics around that, and if there are specific ways that you feel like these requirements could be reduced?
Yeah, so, and actually I have more information to answer board member McGuire's question. So on the Central Coast, there's a requirement that they take for large wineries, 4 samples in their ponds before there's any discharge, and they have to monitor source water once, and there's no requirement for groundwater monitoring. So all told, that costs less than $1,000. And then it would be cheaper for smaller wineries because they only have to take 2 samples rather than the 4 samples. So there's a significant difference between under 1,000 and 44,000. But then Ms. Firestone, to answer your question on if we have, so on the groundwater monitoring, some of the things that we've looked at is, okay, for land application, if you have a lot of processed water and you're applying it on a very small land area, then there is a higher risk of degradation. And that would be something that you could look at as, okay, this is an area where we need to focus. Or if you have a subsurface system and you have a fairly high groundwater table, another situation where there would be a higher risk and we should target in that situation. So you look at the specifics of the situation. And I know that's difficult because you're trying to put together a general order that applies across the whole state. But I don't think just because it's a general order that means that we should require across the board groundwater monitoring. There's still a way to tailor that to the actual risk. Does that get at your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. And maybe, I guess putting it back on staff, can staff explain, are there reductions in monitoring or ways that this builds in reduced or more, reduced monitoring where there's, based on risk within the general permit or general order?
So we have something like that built into the Tier 3 requirements, but in the Tier 4 requirements, it is a blanket. There's groundwater monitoring required. One of the things that we've talked about is that cutoff for that tier the correct number? And we've had some discussions with Noel and others about that. So as it stands, there is no option under the Tier 4. You have to do the groundwater monitoring. There are options under Tier 3 where the regional board can look at site-specific considerations and say, well, it's not required here, but it is required there. So I don't know, Jennifer, did you have anything you want to add to that? Or did
Thanks, Scott.
Was it okay?
I think you answered it pretty well. I think also we want to keep in mind that a lot of the plans and reports and the monitoring really is tailored to the sites. So even though the laundry list does sound pretty extensive, not all tiers are required to do all of them. So it is a lot more minimal for Tier 1s, and it does ramp up as you go to Tier 4. There's also a lot of trigger points. So for example, if you're within the SDS threshold, you don't have to do the salt control plan. It's only for cases where the minimum BPTCs are required, those are not doing, like not cutting it. That's when you would have to do a salt control plan. So I kind of want to just point that out, that it's not a blanket where everything's required for everybody. There are trigger points, and it is based on tier. Thank
and
you.
just on the tier 4, then, where it is blanket required, is there reductions over time that are possible when, you know, I would assume that's needed if there's, so my assumption is that's required because there's a potential for risk at that level of discharge. Is there a reduction in frequency and constituents over time as we see whether there's you know, those potential impacts seem to be manifesting in the particular site. I guess, can you tell me more about how that may reduce over time based on the data and site-specific information, even for tier 4, or is that not something that is built in right now?
So let me jump in and talk a little bit generally about monitoring and reporting requirements. Monitoring and reporting requirements under waste discharge requirements are under the signature of the executive officer, the executive director. So changing the monitoring and reporting requirements is something that can be done over time. I'll leave it to staff to say if there are triggers in this permit to require them to do that, but that is a discretion of the executive officer and executive director to do that without reopening the whole permit.
For individuals that are enrolled in the general order, is what you're saying?
Yes, because it's a model monitoring report, and the regional board actually uses that model monitoring to sign it.
Right, okay.
May I offer something on that though?
Yeah.
When it comes to groundwater monitoring though, there's a significant expense in installing the wells. So while we appreciate that there may be an ability to lower the annual costs when it comes to groundwater monitoring, that one-time initial cost is significant. So if we can figure out a way to avoid that because there isn't a risk, we think that that's the better path.
And Ms. Creamers, is there, I think you mentioned that some wineries, the waste discharge doesn't have significant levels of nitrate, for example, and there's nitrate monitoring. So can you just, it seems like what you're saying is that where that's the case, where the discharges don't have certain constituents, that seems like areas where there could be reduced monitoring requirements or should be reduced monitoring requirements.
Yes, absolutely. So if the effluent has low levels of constituents of concern, then that would be another trigger that you'd look at and say, okay, this doesn't justify.
Yeah, and then of course the question is, what is that threshold? But yeah, no, okay, that's helpful to understand. Thanks for all of that. That's helpful to clarify the issue for me.
You're welcome.
This is Laurel Wardrop. I wanted to just add another thing where we were trying to consider the costs of site-specific plans. There are alternates when an effluent limit is exceeded or a threshold that there can be sustainability program enrollment or a salt nutrient management plan, which shares costs over multiple dischargers. And then for areas like Napa County, the local agency oversight, they would actually be running a program to implement the permit instead of this, and there'd be reduced fees. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Vice Chair, are you?
Yes, the only thing that I would add is that I think it will be important for us to, as Chair Escobar said, to receive information on the economic impact so that we can sort of true it up. But I think the challenge is right now there on these monitoring and reporting issues, for example, there is some discretion depending on what tier you're in. And what I'm hearing from the industry representatives is that they'd like to tighten that up a little bit more and, maybe provide for triggers when certain testing, monitoring, and reporting would be required. So just looking at, which should come first. I think it'd be helpful if we could hear from industry, in discussions with our staff to propose some language on where these issues could be tightened up, through triggers or bookends as to when monitoring and reporting would be required versus discretionary. And then once there seems to be, and I know we've got, sometime between now and November, but the time will fly. And so trying to get a better idea on exactly what would be required and under what circumstances, so that then we could look at the economic costs. Because right now it seems that, and understandably so, we're going to have some wineries, especially those that are concerned about the current economic climate, not having a lot of staff people to do this work, looking at the worst case scenario and then providing that information to us. And so what we don't want to have happen at the end of the day with an economic analysis is us not really being able to rely on it, because in the meantime, we've found ways to kind of tighten up on the language. So just really suggesting that you provide us with suggestions sooner rather than later. And then, after there seems to be some sense of where we're going, then help us with information on economic impacts.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Vice Chair. And yes, I think, and because what I heard a bit there in the back and forth was obviously, yes, kind of worst case scenario, kind of just plain reading of, well, it just enumerating of the requirements seen there. But there's greater discretion and nuance here. And it really does require staff to sit down with folks to just go over and make sure the assumptions that individuals are making as to what is going to be required, or what is the ability, and tightening the clarity, I think, where there is flexibility, or there is, either a trigger approach or otherwise, can be helpful. So, I appreciate that. Okay, well, we'll move on now. And again, thank you for the panel, and thank you for the good discussion. We have, at this point, about 25 individuals. If we keep folks to about 5 minutes, we'll be here for a couple hours worth of just the comment. And please do, this is a workshop, so we're here to ask questions, follow up, et cetera, but just helping folks get a sense of timing. Mr. Couch, I see you here. Did you want to say something before we transition to the next speaker?
Yes, I just, it was my understanding we had another panel presentation.
Oh, a second panel.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Lawford, do we have a second panel queued up? I was going to go to Ms. Kalua otherwise.
She actually is our second panel.
Okay.
And
so she's queued and ready.
Good morning. Good morning. I am a sole panelist.
You're a solo panelist.
Yes.
At that point, you're just a commenter, to be fair.
Fair. But I hope you enjoy my presentation regardless.
Oh, very much so. I appreciate it. Good morning, Ms. Kalua. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Well, good morning, Chair Esquivel, members of the board. My name is Caitlin Kalua. I am the policy analyst for the California Coastkeeper Alliance, which represents local waterkeeper organizations throughout the state. I am thrilled to be following the robust discussion that we just had. So hopefully I can add additional perspective and, of course, look forward to continuing the conversation. Next slide, please. We just want to extend our sincere gratitude for the work done by your staff to this point to develop the new order. As was already said in the previous panel, your staff has been highly receptive to comments to this point, and that we also appreciate the opportunity to speak today, continue that discussion, and raise key issues to ultimately protect the water our communities and environment rely on. Next slide, please. Regarding the scope of this order, very briefly, it is solely limited to wineries, despite similarities in wastewater characteristics shared with breweries and distilleries. As drafted, the order excludes breweries and distilleries, even when spirits, such as brandy, are actually distilled on site of the winery. Wineries, distilleries, breweries all have similar wastewater characteristics, such as high strength BOD and abnormal pH, and we're asking that these industries be included in the scope of this order to prevent an unnecessary regulatory gap. Second, the threshold for labeling a facility as de minimis appears to be extremely high due to the strength of BOD, salinity, nutrients, and unique impacts to soil when discharged to land. Wastewater from winemaking is not necessarily a low threat discharge and arguably is a high risk discharge. The de minimis threshold of 10,000 gallons per year is not insignificant, especially when you look at seasonal variation and the intensive winemaking season. That means that this wastewater is not generated evenly throughout the year. It would be helpful to better understand the justification for this 10,000 gallon per year threshold and potentially to revisit this limit. We recommend that all facilities enroll under this order unless it is otherwise demonstrated that the facility does not pose a threat to surface water or groundwater quality, rather than the other way around as it's drafted in the order. Next slide, please. As was previously discussed, groundwater contamination from nitrates and nutrients is already an enormous challenge facing individual communities and GSAs throughout the state. The Central Coast was mentioned, but again, this is something that is faced in various levels and varying degrees of concentration and issues in California. And overall, we support the use of the agronomic rates in this order to control discharges to land that may introduce additional nitrate and nutrient discharges. The general order, however, only explicitly requires groundwater monitoring for wineries, as we previously discussed, for those that fall under Tier 4, which is the largest size facility tier. We find it highly concerning that Tier 3 facilities, essentially those that produce over 300,000 gallons of processed wastewater each year, are only required to monitor upon direction of the Regional Water Board. Given groundwater impacts already faced by a number of local communities, it's critical that all tiers be required to monitor for groundwater impacts, again, where those threats and that risk does exist. We strongly recommend that staff revisit this groundwater monitoring requirement and require monitoring for all Tier 3 and Tier 4 facilities, essentially to extend that requirement, and that at a minimum, all tiers must conduct groundwater monitoring if site-specific conditions indicate indicate a threat to water quality. Next slide, please. Second, on the topic of processed water ponds, if a storage pond is overtopped or breached, the overflow of nitrates, chemicals, sediment, and turbid water can have significant impacts on nearby surface and groundwater. This general order as drafted allows Tier 1 facilities, those between 10,001 gallons and 100,000 gallons per year, to continue operating existing ponds. To provide additional safeguards to protect water quality, we're requesting that all existing ponds, regardless of their size, be required to demonstrate that overtopping will not impact surface and groundwater by meeting the 100-year 24-hour storm threshold, or providing a technical report that demonstrates the pond can operate without overtopping. Currently, Tier 1 is subject to regional board discretion, and we just again feel this is a space where this can be better tightened. Next slide, please. The current general order also allows for the continued use of an existing lined or unlined pond to be allowed depending on the facility tier or pond performance. The ongoing use of an existing pond, whether lined or unlined, shouldn't be based on facility tier, but only pond performance. Finally, groundwater monitoring again should be required for all unlined processed water ponds to prevent ongoing impacts to groundwater. Next slide, please. Pictured is Waller Bridge located on the Russian River. This is 5 miles downriver of a spill from the Rodney Strong Winery this past January. Even after traveling 5 miles downriver, this was still a concentrated and visible plume with, unfortunately, unknown impacts to the Russian River and its streambed. The point of this slide and the fact is that accidents and spills unfortunately do happen, and that spill containment unfortunately is largely overlooked in this draft order. Spills and unauthorized discharges are prohibited under the order, but there are no explicit BMPs specified to contain spills other than the spill prevention and emergency response plan that is required only for some dischargers. We strongly recommend that this be reconsidered and evaluated by your board to ensure proper BMPs are in place to prevent accidents and spills from impacting our rivers and aquifers. Next slide, please. Local waterkeepers, such as Orange County Coastkeeper, have detected water quality violations from waste haulers and other transport vehicles. It's important to keep in mind that under the Clean Water Act, if wastewater is pumped to a tank truck for disposal elsewhere, that tank truck is considered a point source. This general order, however, does not apply to the transport of processed wastewater that will be treated off-site. The final general order should properly cover the transport of any processed wastewater from a winery and ensure that there are BMPs in place to protect our waterways from any spill that occurs when pumping or transferring wastewater to a container truck. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, due to poor practices witnessed by our local water keepers of individual wineries, sometimes practices such as grading and terracing slopes without proper permits, and then no oversight or action taken by local agencies or land use agencies, our water keepers are deeply concerned with any local agency oversight program that delegates oversight and inspections to local agencies. Further, unfortunately, given the poor performance of some municipalities to attain their water quality standards, we also have very little confidence in these agencies in being responsible for the oversight and inspections to protect water quality. Ultimately, oversight and inspection should be left to the water boards and not be delegated to agencies that are already overburdened and financially strained, both prior and during the COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. And transparent and open data is a cornerstone for ensuring public accountability. The general order provides that, quote unquote, some regions may submit reports and water quality data required by this general order to the state board's GeoTracker database. And we encourage that all data and reports be submitted to this statewide database, which ultimately, I mean, just frankly, is a very useful and transparent tool that we found to monitor trends in water quality. So we do, again, highly recommend that all reports and water quality data be uploaded, essentially. Next slide, please. In conclusion, we do have two additional concerns I would like to share with your board today, just briefly. First, regarding setbacks, we're just curious and request further clarification from your staff to understand how the setback limits, essentially those that are 100 feet from a surface water supply well and 50 feet from a property line, were chosen. We request that essentially these be used as a minimum and that the hydrogeological and site-specific conditions determine the proper setback limit, again, using that threshold as a minimum and maybe not a hard line. And second, regarding the compliance schedule of this order, as drafted, existing facilities have 3 years to submit an NOI and another 5 years to come into compliance with this general order for a total of 8 years, which I think is really important to note given previous comments and concerns regarding costs and the time of compliance, and understanding that this is, it's a new requirement for some facilities that may or may not already exist under a WDR. The general order does allow regional boards to extend this timeframe as appropriate, and we strongly suggest your board provide a timely backstop to prevent any onerous extensions and ultimately to prevent this generous compliance schedule from being pushed back further. With those questions and comments in mind, that concludes my presentation. Thank you. I'm available for further questions, and of course, we look forward to submitting our written comment.
Thank you so much for your comments, Ms. Kalua. Any questions from board members or comment? Hearing none.
I have a question. One of the issues that I have sympathy to is that often the easiest thing for us to do as a regulatory agency is require technical reports to give us assurance that things will be protective. But I think to the extent possible, it would be better to be able to have more performance-based, outcome-based requirements rather than sort of a technical report. And I'm just wondering, I think you mentioned that with respect to pond, maybe, and there may be other things that you did, but that issue too. And I'm just wondering if there were areas or recommendations that you have around where that could be more further built in, so that there isn't, I think that's an area where there's the potential to reduce costs and focus on outcomes and performance. But, you know, I know that's a trade-off and difficult for the regulatory side for us to, you know, have more certainty around. But I'm just, you know, and this may be a follow-up similar to what Vice Chair Diadamo asked, is just, I think to the extent that there's language in areas where we can build that into the permit further than what we have, it would be great to get some suggestions on that.
Yeah, so we are happy to look at tightening up and reducing discretion, but there is the other side of that, which is why there are lots of opportunities for technical reports to show that you don't have to add more treatment.
Right.
The trade-off with a simple trade-off to keep in mind is if we had strict effluent limits that met groundwater quality requirements, we would not need groundwater monitoring. We would say, you've got to meet all of your effluent limits before it comes in contact with the ground. Well, that's an expensive proposition, and many wineries will not be able to meet that. So it doesn't take into account the soil treatment that goes on. And so there's a trade-off that we're trying to meet, a balance between protection of receiving water quality and imposing of strict requirements to allow for technical reports, monitoring, things like that, that can show that in this circumstance, you can have essentially discharge a higher strength waste. So that's just a very crude example, but there's lots of those built in. We're happy to look at that issue.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing you say is that there's the option, you know, to the extent there's the, to the extent we folks can opt for directly meeting performance-based outcome requirements, then they don't need to do the technical report. But if they are concerned that they aren't going to be able to meet that they can then submit a technical report to help adjust for site-specific risk.
So I think that's probably too simplified. We'll have to go through each of the technical reports. There are triggers associated with those reports. And so those are things that that kick in if there's a certain condition.
Right.
And so I'd hate to generalize too much.
Yeah. Okay, great. And Ms. Klua, I don't know if you had something in particular you wanted to respond to that, but can also be a follow-up.
Yeah, happy to follow up. We certainly agree that, again, we do want this to be performance-based, and again, not a blanket purely based on necessarily facility size or tier per se, but the actual, again, performance. In this case, that was performance ponds, but certainly there's other, the order is quite extensive with different activities that are explicitly listed in the general order, and we're happy to take you know, a closer look at that and follow up as well.
Thank you, Ms. Kalua, and thank you, board member. I appreciate the engagement. Okay, I think we're ready to go to our next speaker, and we have Mr. Bob Gore here to join us. Mr. Gore, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Chair and board members. On behalf of the California Association of Wine Grape Growers, we fully support the Wine Institute's comments. And we also echo the board's, all of you expressed concerns yesterday during the ELAP conversation about the cost of compliance, fine-tuning regulatory orders with the current crisis economy. In particular with wine grape growers, we've been part of our own sustainability certified program since the mid 2000s, as launched by our friend Karen Ross when she was executive director. Wine is iconic. It is indicative of the entire California economy. And we need to, as Jonathan said, specifically align as much as possible the monitoring and reporting programs with threat and risk. Having been a part of a 4-year effort for another general order for another commodity. I know this is possible, and we will continue to work with the board and appreciate your attention to this detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gore. Much appreciated. Next, we'll go to Kim Withrow, sorry. And Ms. Withrow, I think you indicated you only need to speak if necessary. So I will, good morning, we see you now.
Good morning, I'm here.
Hello.
And I would actually like to say a few words, I think, about the local agency program and specifically. Thank you for hosting this meeting and presenting. So I work for Napa County. My name is Kim Withrow. I've been working here for about 20 years. Napa County has been implementing the winery wastewater program since the 1980s under an MOU and a written delegation agreement from our regional board. For nearly 40 years, we've been working with our local wine industry and regional board staff to ensure adequate treatment and discharge of winery wastewater. We currently have about 8 registered environmental health specialists and 2 permit technicians that work in this program. And we've been working since the pandemic started. We've boots on the ground out doing inspections. So, I mean, we have our economy here has been impacted, but we still have our staff here doing the work that we need to do. The primary regional water quality control board that we work with currently has 1 staff person, and Napa County isn't the only county in that region. So the order as presented doesn't seem to encourage local agency oversight. In fact, it seemed to discourage us from applying to keep the program. As written, the order places added burden on the wine industry of having to apply to both the state and the local agency and pay additional fees. The order needs to allow local oversight while reducing the burden on regional board staff and the wine industry. In the order where it says report or demonstrate to the Regional Water Quality Control Board, we feel that it should also say or the local agency, or it should be clear. If that's not the case, we want to make sure we know. Additionally, the order is very detailed about the responsibilities of the local agency. However, there are no responsibilities or duties listed of the water board staff. Are they required to conduct construction inspections and respond to spills and discharges? What is the time frame for water board staff to respond to a discharger after they submit an NOI? Will all the technical reports and monitoring results even be reviewed by the water board staff and responded to in a timely manner? So those are just some of our questions. We will be submitting written comments regarding other aspects of the order, and we appreciate the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time you took this morning to speak. I look forward to the comprehensive written comments as well. I know certainly the region and its longstanding local program is a consideration for us as we're trying to do this work. So just thank you for the engagement. And I believe I have another representative from the County of Napa here. Are they there in the room with you, or?
No, she's actually in her office. I'm not sure if she's speaking or not. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Withrow. Next up, we have here on the list, Ms. Sichelli. I apologize if I've butchered your last name there, but Mr. Lawford, do you know if we have her in the room here?
Good morning. Yes, I'm in my office.
Oh, good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. I just had the thing pop up that said that you wanted to unmute me. I didn't know if you had a question of me or if you were just making sure I didn't have anything else to add. I think Kim did a pretty good job of identifying some of our concerns with the local program. We've always indicated to the regional board through all these discussions that we would absolutely implement the order as it was written, and that we realize that would be extra work on our staff, but we also feel like the benefits to that outweigh any of that extra work. Benefits to industry, benefits to the regional board and state board staff. We realize it's going to mean some program changes for us, but we do feel like we can provide some value. And I think we would need more clarity in the way that the order is written. Kim mentioned it shall be, it's so ordered section talks about all of what the regional board or state board would do, but nowhere in that does it ever say, if you're a local agency, the local agency will do these things. And so I think that the local agency program just needs to be vetted or clarified a little bit. But we will be providing some comments, and we have some other thoughts on the order, but I don't think we need to bring them up right now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Seshele. And yes, I was just making sure you had an opportunity to provide additional thought and comment, and you did. And so
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next, call up Ms. Carrie Fisher from California Farm Bureau Federation.
Hello, good morning. Thank
Good
you.
morning.
I'm Carrie Fisher with the California Farm Bureau Federation, and we support the comments made earlier by Noelle Kramers. I just had a few additional points of questions, and we appreciate working with staff over the last couple of years and some of the changes that have been made. We still have some additional issues and questions. One of the big ones is the fact that it isn't acknowledged in the draft order how the winery WDR will interplay with various irrigated lands programs throughout the state with regard to how the vines themselves are regulated. For those that are not aware, the vines themselves will continue to be covered under the irrigated lands programs. And with that, there is extensive groundwater monitoring and surface water monitoring, nitrogen and irrigation management reporting, your nitrogen applied versus removed, nitrogen applied minus removed, the multi-year rolling average, which are all precedential requirements of the East San Joaquin WDR that apply or will apply once certain regions update their irrigated lands programs. And in all of that will accompany all of the different applications of nitrogen, including nitrogen in irrigation water, such as this processed water. So we see a lot of duplication and conflicts. And there are a lot of ways in which integrating existing programs and monitoring could be done with this order, which would also be a cost reduction. In addition, one other issue we have is the reference to CV salts or other salt and nitrate management plans throughout the state. Although we do appreciate that they are referenced, there is some potential areas where the language in the draft order could be revised or tightened up, because as we currently read it, in areas such as the Central Valley where a winery and the vineyards would be regulated under their irrigated lands program and have to comply with the salt and or the nitrogen components of the CV salts, that is not necessarily covered in regard to the requirements under the WDR, the winery WDR, in the sense that the way that the language is written is it's up to the discretion of the regional board if the grower or the actual winery would have to also do an additional nitrogen control plan and or a salt control plan in addition to already what they're doing under CV salts as required under their irrigated lands program. So there's just a lot of ambiguity in those areas, and we're hopeful that we can work with staff to try to get these recognized.
Much appreciated, Ms. Fisher. Next, we'll move on to, and I believe actually Helena Welsh, it may not be in the room here with us if you are watching from the webcast. Otherwise, please do reach out to the clerk of the board and we'll hopefully get you in here. But Mr. Loffer, is that still the case?
That is correct. So Mr. Bailey would be our next speaker then.
All right, great. Mr. Bailey, good morning.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Phil Bailey, representing the Temecula Valley Wine Growers Association, and it's great to see you again. I know some of you, I had the pleasure of showing some of you my operation down there in Temecula and how I've been handling wastewater for the last 20 years, but just under an individual order from the San Diego region. But just to go over it, I have 2 percolation ponds, one for the crush pad and one for the waste generated inside the winery. My total discharge is about 50 to 60,000 gallons annually. So that puts me right in the middle of tier 1. And I provide, at the present time, I provide semi-annual reports of amounts discharged, maintenance activities, and discharge composition. I do grab samples that go to a lab again twice a year with those reports. I would like to address 2 points in the general order. First, the prohibition on unlined ponds in the future. I think, as you saw when you were there, the ones that were there in the Temecula Valley, we have decomposed granite soils and a low water table. And so the percolation ponds really work well. They're a low cost, efficient, and safe method for small wineries. My pond is usually dry, and even with heavy water use during crush, the wastewater usually perks within a few days. We would like to see percolation ponds as an option in the future for all new wineries, at least in Temecula. I understand other parts of the state, it might be a little different. But second, the pond monitoring and reporting requirements, has been alluded to several times today, seem to be overkill for tier 1 and tier 2 wineries. This section should be revised to take into account the insignificant amount of effluent. To look at my own numbers, last year's effluent was 59,240 gallons, of which 58,227 was tap water. That's only 1,000 gallons of grape juice, wine, suspended solids, and a minuscule amount of cleaning chemicals. I missed my notes here. Anyway, I find it hard to understand how these extensive tests of incoming and outgoing water for these small amounts of effluent are really necessary. So in conclusion, I just like to ask that you keep perspective on the whole thing and not burden us with at least tier 1 and 2, tier 2 with expensive, time-consuming, and unnecessary requirements. So, but that's that. And of course, I wasn't speaking just for myself. I was speaking for the wineries here in the Temecula Valley. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for your comments and for hosting some of the board members here and the continued engagement. Really appreciate the comments and thoughts today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Michelle Novi from Napa Valley Vintners.
Great, thank you.
Good morning.
I have notes kind of all over the place, so I apologize if this isn't as structured as I would like. But first, I want to thank you, the board, and thank the staff for having this workshop. And my original comments were kind of structured around the idea that so often in the regulatory process, at least what I've witnessed, things get so far down the line that policy comes into place because of momentum, because of all the work that's been done, and not necessarily because it's good policy. And I've had that concern about this process since 2015, but I'm really encouraged by what the kinds of questions that I've heard from the board and the responsiveness of staff. And I would encourage everyone who has a decision-making role in this process to continually challenge the assumptions that are driving the need for these policies, because they do affect people at the singular business level. That is what, with the Napa Valley Vintners, that is what I've been focused on for the last 4 months, is making sure that our 550 winery members can stay in business. And I say this not to be dramatic or, to evoke some kind of emotional response, but to really let you know that the situation is dire for California wineries, and the recovery period that we're looking at is 3 to 5 years or longer. Many small operators are going to be put on the ropes and are going to have to decide whether or not they can even stay in business. And so these decisions that you are making and policies that you are evaluating and putting into effect have real consequences. And I would continue to encourage you to keep that in mind. It's my role at the Vintners to explain the regulations to our members, and it's a challenge to explain to them sometimes when we have a situation in Napa County where environmental stewardship is a long tradition of ours, and it is in our, not only is it the right thing to do, but it's in our continued best interest to be good stewards of the land. To explain to our members why these policies are being put in place, even when the evidence from existing monitoring shows that the issues that this policy may be trying to solve, these problems that the policy may be trying to solve, aren't actual problems, at least for us in Napa County. I also want to speak to the Napa Valley Vintners' support of the Wine Institute's comments and their leadership on this issue. We're very grateful to them, and also acknowledge Napa County and our local area management plan. Napa County staff are incredibly responsive. They are public servants to making sure that water quality objectives are met in Napa County, and our winery members, our vintners, are incredibly grateful to have that support. And so to the extent that any regulation is promulgated, please acknowledge and support the existence of that local management. They are doing a good job and they are serving our needs, and we are incredibly grateful to them. I do just want to circle back to say that as Noelle mentioned in her presentation, there are areas for improvement, and based on the current reading, this order would be untenable for many of our wineries, just from a cost and staffing perspective. And I look forward to working with the board staff to address these issues and really ensure that we do meet water quality objectives. It's in all of our best interests, but having a broad brush policy, a kind of a somewhat one size fits all, doesn't make sense for us. And so I would really ask you again to question some of the basic assumptions, to listen to the feedback that we are giving you. We're not being dramatic. This is not workable in its current form. And we do believe that there is a way to meet the water board's objectives while still allowing wineries to stay in business. Thank you.
So much for your time and comments, Ms. Novi. Yeah, we are, as you know, very interested in making sure we strike the right balance here. Let alone the fact that it's been a 5-year effort, I think shows just how cautiously we've approached the discussion, and will continue to do so and wanting to ensure that it really gets to the outcomes that we're looking for. And hopefully what you hear is the challenge of putting on requirements across the state that really capture the great variety and dynamic nature of the many different wineries out there, their different processes, and trying to do best. So appreciate the engagement. It's critical. So, and thank you. Next, we'll move on to Devin Jones from Mendocino County Farm Bureau. And I'll flag after Mr. Jones, we will take a 15-minute break.
Good morning, board. This is Devin Jones with Mendocino County Farm Bureau. And again, I just want to reiterate the appreciation for the conversation this morning. You know, we have been engaged over the past several years with the Wine Institute, our local winery operators, and board staff on this specific draft. And so we appreciate that. Just a little bit of background. Obviously, it was touched on this morning, and Mendocino County is not separated at all from the impacts to our winery industry specific to COVID. We currently have closures in our tasting rooms. We have had impacts to tourism. Most of our events, if not all of our events, have been canceled. So there is going to be a significant continued economic impact to the winery industry in Mendocino County. So that being said, I don't think you're going to hear from many winery operators directly this morning, especially those that you may have been familiar with on your visit here to Hopland, but we will continue to be engaged as this process moves forward. In our county, a typical winery is family owned and operated, and the vineyards are here where the grapes are produced. We have around 80 plus wineries where we practice sustainability, carbon neutral practices, biodynamic and organic farming, and innovative approaches to minimizing our impacts. So we will continue to be engaged on this issue as it moves forward, and we'll be preparing more extensive comments for submittal. Just a couple of areas today that I would like to specifically comment on that are issues that we have commented on over the last several years. One is related to ponds. So the WDR currently requires all ponds that hold any processed water to be lined, and this is going to be a challenge. This is going to lead to significant downtime and expense in order to install a liner, which will impact winery operations. And I have an example here. So one Mendocino County winery installed a liner on a 2.5 acre foot pond, and this is in 2018, so times have changed a bit. The pond was drained in April, and the liner and infrastructure were in place by the end of September. This means the pond was offline for almost a full farming winery cycle. The cost of this process was just under $120,000, or roughly $48,000 per acre foot of storage. Pricing can become more efficient in certain situations for larger ponds. However, this is a realistic cost analysis for smaller ponds that are used in Mendocino County. If winery process water is analyzed coming out of the winery and water quality standards are met through source control practices, then requiring a lining a pond is costly and duplicative. It should not be a mandated requirement. Several winery process water ponds in Mendocino County, a number of those we actually visited directly when you were here in Hopland, are mixed with other water sources. The processed water is diluted and used for irrigation and or frost protection in a land application setting. With mixed ponds, application limits should not be based on total water used, since not all the water being applied is actual processed water. So there needs to be additional clarification in the conversation of what the definition of processed water is in relation to mixed ponds. So the second component I would like to bring up is on the subsurface disposal. We've got some wineries in Mendocino County that have advanced pressure distribution leach fields. They've been engineered, locally permitted. However, this current WDR treats these advanced systems the same as old school gravity-driven systems. So the current WDR will require costly upgrades to these systems to ensure the effluent limits are met. So I think the properly engineered and operated systems working to prevent groundwater contamination are in place, and this needs to be considered so it's not just a one-size-fits-all. So those are the two areas I would like to bring forward this morning. And again, we will be submitting more extensive comments, and we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really do appreciate the comments. So, it's going to be 11:30. It's going to be a break, and we'll go for maybe about an hour and a half more, and then we'll take a late lunch then, I'm thinking. Let's go ahead and take a break, mid-morning break here for ourselves. We'll just make it 10 minutes so that we can kind of keep moving on here. 11:35 is when we'll return. And just to flag, I have a few folks in my queue here that aren't on the Zoom platform here in the room with us. If you're watching via webcast, Jessica Rose, Mr. John Nagel, Katie Blodoff, please do reach out to comment letters at waterboards.ca.gov just to make sure we can, or you should have already the link to the Zoom platform in your inbox. Just try to get onto the platform and we'll try to get to you.
And Chair Esquivel, if I can ask, we have one individual on the Zoom platform who has a phone number in the 707 area code and ending in 847. If that individual can send an email to the clerk of the board at janine.townsend@waterboards.ca.gov and let us know who they are so that we can assign a name to them and they can be called on when we get to them in the queue.
Okay, much appreciated. We'll be back here at 11:35. Hello, hello. I think we're ready to get back here. Hope everyone had a nice break. I think, so we have John Nagel, who's listed as next, but Mr. Lawfer, is he still not in the room with us?
That's correct. He was in earlier and he dropped off, and he was listed as an if necessary only. So it's possible he decided he did not need to speak.
Okay, yes. Well, apologies, Mr. Nagel, if it simply took too much time to get to you here. Next, then we have Bob Troback. Sorry on that one, Mr. Troback.
That's all right, and I do not need to add anything at this point in time.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you, and thank you for your participation today. I have a block of folks that it's looking like they're not in the room. Is that correct here, Mr. Lawfer? So we would go next to Stuart Childs.
Oh, I'm audible now?
Yes, yeah, you should be
Stuart
audible.
Childs. I also have no comment at this time.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
Great. Thank you. Next, we have Craig Cooper from Nickel and Nickel Winery. And Mr. Cooper, you should be invited here to share, if you would like, your video. Not necessary, though. And then otherwise to be unmuted.
So we have given Mr. Cooper the opportunity to unmute his microphone, and it doesn't appear that he is taking us up on the offer.
Okay, that's more than okay then. Mr. Cooper, if you would like to provide comment here, then out of order, I think you should. Can individuals raise their hands or anything in the Zoom platform?
Yes, they can. If they are using the Zoom application, there is a raise hand feature under the participant list. And we do have a couple of people who have called in that we've not matched up so far. And there is an ability to raise hands on the phone. I'll have to look up the code for that. I want to say it's like *4, but I will announce that at the next break.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Laffer. Really appreciate that. Then next in line, we have Michelle Benavuto from Wine Growers of Napa County. Good morning. Yes, still morning. I believe we can't currently hear your audio, but you're not on mute on our end. So your microphone may, it may be your earbuds. Hold on one moment.
So Ms. Benavuto, on the Zoom application on your computer, in the lower left corner of the screen, there should be an unmute button, but you might need to select whether you're speaking from a microphone. There's a little arrow next to it in most instances, and if you click up on that arrow, it might give you the opportunity to select a microphone from your computer.
Yes. Or the earbud mics.
Okay, and if that doesn't work, do you still have the email from Miss Townsend? Because we'll also have a phone number where you could call in, and if you have a phone available, you can call in and we can quickly marry up the audio from your phone call with the video that we have of you.
Sorry, bear with us one moment. Still trying to help Ms. Benvenuto get some audio here. Ms. Benvenuto, again, you can call in on a line at this point, and it'll sync up. Okay, you are. Okay.
And then as soon as she's, as we see her appear in the participant list, we'll quickly join her up with the video that we already have.
Oh, she's 847. Okay. There we
All
are.
right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Sorry about
Oh,
that confusion.
okay.
My internet connection was being unstable. Well,
Oh,
good
it's fine.
morning. I'm
morning.
Michelle Benvenuto with the Wineries of Napa.
Hold on one second. We seem to have temporarily lost her. Ms. Benvenuto, what we were doing was we were
Yes.
merging your phone and your video. So you should be
Okay,
good
she's
now.
there.
Go ahead and start.
There you are. Sorry about that.
I am so sorry about that.
Oh, it's
All
okay.
right,
It doesn't count against your time. So
Wineries of Napa County, Michelle Benvenuto, thank you for having me today and allowing us to comment. Not sure where I got cut off, but Winegrowers' mission is to advance policy that preserves sustainable agriculture as the highest and best use of the natural resources while protecting the ability of wineries to produce, market, and sell wine. So here in Napa County, we've been monitoring groundwater since the mid-1900s, and the data shows stable long-term trends of Napa's groundwater, both the quantity and quality. Winegrowers, Napa County, and the community recognize the importance of groundwater and that it's essential to protecting agriculture, fish, wildlife, and our livelihood. Your own, the state's own GIS, which is the Groundwater Information System, provides significant groundwater data. And we question why this data wasn't utilized to create a program that focus on the areas that need additional monitoring rather than a blanket one-size-fits-all policy that does not recognize areas and wineries that are at lower risk. Specifically, there's also issues we have with the existing permitted system. Like if the system is fully functioning, it seems to ignore that a system is fully functioning and poses no risk and expects, in a lot of cases, a full redesign of a system. Also, what happens to our local NAPA program? The Napa County has provided much oversight, guidance, and monitoring, yet the order seems to ignore and actually even discourage local programs and provides no value add to continuing the local program. It was mentioned that there could be reduced monitoring fees, but the order is unclear about that even, and it definitely requires duplicative enrollment and fees, both state and locally. So Napa County was also one of the first, was the first county in California to create an agriculture preserve to protect agricultural land. And the CEQA document for this order does not address the very real possibility that hundreds of acres of vineyards may need to be converted to wastewater treatment areas in order to separate domestic and winery waste streams. In order to avoid converting vineyard land and the high cost to comply to this order, the winery may need to pursue hauling its wastewater to a public treatment facility like East Bay Mud. And we don't feel the CEQA document has evaluated these impacts. Finally, we support everything that Noel Creamers from the Wine Institute reviewed and emphasize the economic strain that wineries, as well as California and even globally, is experienced given the current pandemic. So we urge the Water Board to not only delay enacting this order, but review the order for its overreach, the duplicative monitoring, the one-size-fits-all approach of assuming all regions in California are the same. We propose an order that protects the public interest and moves the ball forward by focusing on identified problems and does not create unreasonable bureaucracy and costs that could be the difference between a winery surviving and not surviving. So thank you very much again. And sorry again about the connecting problems.
No, the apology is ours. Thank you. And thanks for bearing this. And thank you for your comments. It's much appreciated, Ms. Benvenu.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we have Lad Calhoun from the Edcombe Law Group.
Mr. Calhoun, we've given you the chance to unmute your microphone or turn on your camera at this point.
And Mr. Calhoun may not be wishing to speak.
Correct. That's
okay.
He's declined our invitation so far, so we can probably move on to the next speaker.
Then we'll move on to Mr. Ted Wells.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Good morning, Mr. Wells.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for giving us the chance to offer some comments here. I'm Ted Wells. I work at a winery, and certainly my comments hopefully are very similar to Noel's and Kim's and Michelle's, who you just heard. I'd offer just a couple of thoughts on this. I think certainly this is a just cause, right? I think we can all agree on that. A couple of metrics that I could throw out for TFE is, water reuse. As we think about water reuse and the industry water reuse, in fact, we reuse about 70% of our water, right? So we get to use it the first time for cleaning, and then we get to use it a second time for landscape or whatever else we want to, growing crops, right? So 70% I think is pretty good. I don't know the industry number, but I can just tell you the number from the operations that I have the privilege to serve. And so I guess I'll tell you my worry. My worry is that with this duplicative costs, right, it's going to affect a couple key metrics. The first metric, is obvious, right? Percent of water reused. That metric might go down, right? In fact, I would guess it will go down in the current construct. The other metric that is probably near and dear to my heart and probably many others is greenhouse gas footprint. I think that this has a potential to increase the footprint, and I'll tell you why. Just an example for facilities that I've got, just for the consultant cost alone for groundwater monitoring every quarter, right? I'll spend 40 grand per site. So if you translate that 40 grand into what I could transport off site at 20 cents a gallon, that's 200,000 gallons, right? Give or take, right? So now we're in a situation where a smaller site might have a much easier break-even cost just to ship the stuff off site, right? And so I'm worried that now we got more trucks on the road, we got more greenhouse gases, we've got less water used twice. And for 40,000, that's simply the consultant cost for ongoing groundwater monitoring. So I'm just saying that just to underscore that extra cost. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next person.
I really appreciate that, Mr. Wells. Again, I think earlier you may have heard there was a good bit of discussion amongst us about making sure we drill down and understand best those cost estimates. Making sure that again, I think we'll continue to drill down, and I appreciate the data here and look forward to maybe a more detailed engagement as we go through to try to best understand what the consequences of our requests are, and that those numbers are based off of what the actual costs are likely to be. And so just thank you, much appreciated. Next, we'll move to Susan Zayshell from the Jackson Family Wines.
And we have given.
I have no comment.
There we go.
Okay. Well, and
Hi.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Next would be Andy Harris from Chuparosa Vineyards.
And there you go, Mr. Harris. We've given you the chance to speak. We'll ask again, and just let us know if you choose not to. You'll need to unmute your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Hello.
My name is Andy Harris. I operate a set of vineyards in a small winery in San Diego County. I am a member of the Wine Institute. I wanted to point out one thing that perhaps hasn't been addressed in the comments to date. And that is, I'm in a unique position where I'm kind of teetering on the edge here of between de minimis and tier 1. And I'd like you to look at what it takes to go from the de minimis category to the tier 1 and the cost incurred. You've heard from many, many other speakers already this morning, Phil Bailey in particular up in Temecula, who is a friend, by the way, full disclosure, that he's a tier 1 winery and he's putting out maybe 59,240 gallons of water a year, of which 58,227 is tap water. The other 1,000 is contains some sort of BODs or dissolved salts to some description. This growing requirement we've got that requires that we have to have monthly sampling of all winery effluent if you're tier 1, pond monitoring, LAA monitoring inspection required daily when the LAA disposal is in use, solids disposal till an LAA. You've heard from several different people already what kind of costs these will entail. I believe the estimates that you heard from the previous speaker and several others are fairly accurate. But I'd like you to think for a moment of stepping what you do from de minimis. Let's say your output of wastewater goes from 8,000 gallons a year up to 12,000 gallons a year. So for that additional 4,000 gallons of wastewater, I suddenly incur on the order of $30,000 to $50,000 a year in monitoring costs. What you've essentially done is build a stopgap in where wineries will no longer be able to continue to grow and increase their production, and that can be fatal to the industry. And I'd like you to take go back and relook at moving at what tier 1 and tier 2 requirements would be for monitoring. A couple of examples, and then I will definitely relinquish the microphone. But if you look at requirements for pond monitoring, we characterize our effluents very thoroughly, and then we pump it out to an LAA, and we get to characterize what's in the LAA again. Many of these things are redundant. Just quickly look at solids disposal. At a small winery here, most of our solids are stems, pomace, seeds, things that come from the crush operations. The requirement that's currently in WDR is that we go and pull sampling for each one of these, each application before you can direct apply and till it into the soil or put it in some place where the leachate can be collected and be part of your processed water. I would point out to you that a bucket of stems in a tractor, the chemical analysis for it does not change from load to load, and neither does it for pomace or seeds. I would think there would be some happy ground or medium we could find here where if it's a standard load out of your press or a standard load out of your destemmer, that can say, okay, we know what's in there and we can do it without sampling, because it's these sampling requirements that are going to eventually eat us alive. So those are the one thing I wanted you to consider that has not been spoken to before about growth of the wine industry or the ability for the wine industry to grow or not to grow. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you as well for your time, Mr. Harris, and for joining us today and the feedback and input. It's much appreciated. Next up on my list, I have Susan Captain from Captain Vineyards. Oh, and sorry, I apologize. Before going to Susan, I see Craig Cooper has revealed his camera at least here. Mr. Cooper, just wanted to make sure that you weren't looking to speak. I know you were higher up.
Yes, no, I wasn't prepared to speak. I'm just following along.
Okay, great. Thank you, and glad you're following along with us. Thank you. Good morning. Still morning. 5 minutes. Yes, Mr. Loffer?
Chair Esquivel, we do have, although we don't have her identified in the Zoom meeting, Ms. Giacconi has indicated she needs to speak before noon. Ms. Giacconi, we have a couple devices that we were unable to identify. If you are on your phone, if you can press *9, that will raise your hand and we can identify you and unmute you. Or there we go. We now recognize which device you've got. So we will get you in. And so it's Ms. Gina Giacconi who's up next, Chair Esquivel.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. I could not figure out how to change my name because it was under my husband's name. Thank
Good
you
morning.
for all. Good morning. Thank you for all the previous comments from everybody else. I think there's a lot of consensus amongst most of the people on the call. We too, I work with Summit Engineering. I'm the water wastewater division manager at Summit Engineering, and we work with a lot of wineries throughout California and help with the permitting oversight. And we have a number of comments that we will be submitting in writing, but a couple of things that I wanted to point out are related to some of the smaller facilities that have commingled systems, specifically subsurface commingled systems, and how those will be handled. Because from what I've read, and I think somebody spoke to this earlier, but from what I've read, this applies only to winery waste discharge and not commingled. So would those facilities then be required to have individual waste discharge requirements, or would the local permitting agency have oversight? That is not clear to us. And then secondly, I think that there's kind of a gap in terms of this covers the waste discharge requirements side and the monitoring side, but what about the construction and installation oversight? Currently, most local agencies, Napa County in particular, oversees a lot, and other counties within California, they oversee construction of subsurface systems. You have to get a septic permit for construction. Sonoma County does not. They do not issue permits for subsurface septic systems for winery wastewater. So there's no real oversight over who is the permitting authority for construction of those systems. I ran into a recent situation where we needed to repair an existing subsurface system for a winery, and the local agency wanted to have nothing to do with it. The regional board didn't really have the means to oversee a repair of a subsurface system. And so I see that as being an issue moving forward for facilities, since there are many that do have subsurface systems. And those were my two main comments. And like I said, otherwise I will be submitting additional comments in writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Really appreciate the verbal comments and look forward to the written ones. Maybe just quickly on the issue of commingled and subsurface systems, Mr. Bishop, is there any clarity that we can provide in the immediate here?
Well, I believe that the commenter is correct that at this point the order essentially excludes commingled domestic waste from process waste for being eligible on this order. We have heard these comments and we expect to receive comments in writing to look at that issue. Generally, the biggest concern with commingled waste is if there's an opportunity for exposure, public health issues related to that. So we're interested in seeing the folks' comments and seeing if we need to make some tweaks on the subsurface discharge, which is different than using it as a land application.
Great. Okay, thank you. Much appreciated. I have Mark Caddy here from California Department of Food and Agriculture, but I don't believe he's in the room. Is that still correct, Mr. Loffer?
That is correct, although we have two phone numbers who did not, now we have one phone number, who did not get associated with the name. So if Mr. Caddy is on the line, if he can press *9 on his phone to raise his hand if he wishes to speak. Otherwise, you can move on to your next individual who likewise may not be on, and that's Miss Susan Captain. Miss Captain, if you are on the phone and press *9, we will be able to identify you. And otherwise, it should be Miss Kipps.
Okay. Joanne Kipps. And I believe this is our last public comment.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Good afternoon.
Thanks. I used to work for the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Board, and I retired in 2010, and I have a lot of experience with the wineries, especially the larger ones in the Central Valley region. And I'm very much encouraged by the state board taking the lead on developing a general order so that all wineries are sort of on the same economic footing in terms of the need to comply with applicable water quality control plans and the law and et cetera. And I can imagine the difficulty of you trying to establish specifications that would apply for the various sizes of wineries. Now, I don't have very much experience with the smaller ones, but I have experience with the larger ones. And I have to tell in all being frankful, that groundwater degradation and outright pollution is pretty much the rule and not the exception for winery wastewater discharges. And so I just have the impression from the dischargers that are commenting that their concern is that it's just too onerous and too costly. And I just wanted to remind them that discharging of waste is a privilege. It's not a right. And that if it is necessary to evaluate and monitor your discharge to ensure that you're not causing problems, then that's the cost of doing business. But in any event, looking at the smaller facilities, I was wondering if you guys, staff-wise, had ever considered the possibility of just simply having their small wineries characterize their discharge by doing it extensively initially, and then perhaps by characterizing it with a 90% or so, identify what the basic BOD and the nitrogen would be, and then the BOD loading rates and the nitrogen loading rates could be determined simply by monitoring how much water is applied and analyzing the area of the discharge application. And that way they don't have to continually do this BOD and nitrogen monitoring. And perhaps like every 3 years, have them confirm that what they're discharging is comparable to what they initially characterized. And I think that kind of approach might be much more cost effective for the smaller wineries. And it would have a safety factor if you were to characterize it with a 90–95% confidence level. So that's just something to consider, because BOD loading, you know, it's a miracle happens in the soil profile, basically, and it's never really been technically proven that what you're requiring or limiting the loading is really protective of groundwater quality. Because as far as I know, the California League of Food Processors manual, and I believe the Wine Institute manual that is being cited in these in the general order, has not been subject to technical peer review. And I think that should be disclosed in the general order. I've asked similar things of Central Valley Water Board staff, and they have included a disclosure in their WDRs that reference the manual, that it has not been technically peer reviewed. And I have to say that another way that you can maybe monitor quickly and efficiently is maybe have the people put soil moisture probes or something just cost effective, that they would monitor soil aeration levels, that provided that it's not saturated, that they can apply. You know, you just think out of the box with low cost monitoring probes. And these are my suggestions, because I can really understand the concern for the smaller wineries. It's just, it's beyond probably what they can afford. And if you could tailor-made your requirements for these smaller wineries, now the larger wineries are totally on a separate page. They do need groundwater monitoring, site specific. You can't rely on regional groundwater, because that doesn't identify the groundwater that's immediately impacted by the discharger. And so I hope that staff holds to its guns and requires groundwater monitoring, because that is the way of determining whether the discharge is protective of groundwater quality, because we need to protect our groundwater quality for future generations. So that's pretty much my verbal comments, and I'll submit some written comments by the deadline. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Kipps, for the creative thought and the previous work as well at the regional board. Really appreciate you taking the time and lending your expertise further here with comment. So thank you.
Thank you.
I believe we have one additional speaker. Going to see if Christina Nicholson is.
So I hope that staff
desiring
to its guns and requires groundwater monitoring, because that is the way of determining whether the discharge is
So I suspect what's going on is Ms. Nicholson was watching the Cali PA feed. Hey, Ms. Nicholson, would you like to address the board?
Sure, yes, I think I am a little bit behind on the video. But yes.
So you are now live into the meeting, and the board is listening for your comments.
Okay, I just wanted to thank everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak. I work for Bartelt Engineering in Napa, and I'm kind of providing comments from more of a technical viewpoint. I do want to emphasize the points that were brought up earlier by the Wine Institute and the Napa Valley Vintners, and also kind of re-emphasize what Napa County said regarding, how much employees that they have on staff and the time that they put into handling the number of systems that are installed here in Napa County and similar other counties, and just the technical feedback that they have to provide to us when we're actually trying to design the systems, get the permits, review construction, and then segue into the monitoring and operating portion of that. I just want to make sure that the regional board will be staffed to accommodate that or provide enough technical, guidance to the local agency to allow them to do that. And I do want to bring up another point about the setback requirements. A lot of the wineries in Napa County will be in smaller size. Some could be around 10-acre parcels, less or more, with about a 30,000 gallon per year permit. They're surrounded by property lines. A lot of them will have 1 to 2 wells. They'll have various drainage courses to accommodate for stormwater runoff. So when you apply all of the setbacks listed in the WDR current draft, it could leave very little room for a wastewater dispersal field. So I don't know if there's some sort of language that could be put in there to allow for a reduction in that with maybe increased treatment or some sort of wiggle room so that they have flexibility to still have a legally conforming system on a smaller parcel. And then, also I just wanted to emphasize too about the delay in getting the results back from the lab that was brought up earlier with the ELAPs overwhelming them. And the fact that you may not even know if you have an exceedance when you're discharging until after the fact. But those are all of my upfront comments. I have some more that we will be addressing. But again, I just want to make sure that there will be enough resources for when I, for instance, have a question. Who do I send my question to about my pond design on a specific site? Does that go to the regional board? And who's going to be providing that feedback? Again, I just want to say thank you for letting me talk, and I look forward to hearing some responses.
Thank you for taking the time and providing the comment, and looking forward to further engagement. And thank you for further questions, and look forward to written comment as well. Mr. Cahoon, are you looking to provide comment now?
Yes.
Good morning, or good afternoon, rather.
It is afternoon, yeah. But a shorter meeting than expected by far. And I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chair, and board members for the opportunity to speak. I will be quick. I'm speaking today on behalf of just one client, and I'm doing this on a volunteer basis. My client's Mackenzie Mueller Vineyards and Winery. It's a small family-owned operation in the Carneros area of Napa with only 3 dedicated winery employees, so quite small. I'd like to echo the comments and support the comments of Noel Kramers of the Wine Institute, and Michelle Novia of Napa Valley Vintners, and Michelle Nudo, the wine growers of Napa. Our main concern here is one, that the cost and burden of this order is excessive in light of the very, very likely and predictable impacts on small operations. We need to go back to the drawing board and make changes to better suit this order to small operations. I know virtually every order the board has ever had before it for consideration has been met with comments from dischargers or the public about the cost and burden. But in this case, it's true. There is an industry as a whole that's having unprecedented trouble. You've heard the word unprecedented, but it's true. They're struggling under the pandemic orders with inability to do business in the way they've been used to. And sales are struggling, profitability is struggling. And many small wineries are seriously considering whether or not they can remain in business. If they don't remain in business, they'll have to sell out their operations to larger companies and move on. That's not an exaggeration, that's a fact. That's the situation on the ground. So we question the need for this kind of order at this particular time. We'd like to question also whether there's been additional justification for this proposed blanket application. In much of the state, as we've heard already, the data simply don't support any assertion that there's a groundwater problem anywhere approaching the burden imposed on individual wineries to address the situation. So really it's this order as structured now with a blanket statewide approach is a solution looking for a problem. So in addition to many of the good comments that have been made and suggestions for improvements that have been made, we'd like to suggest using the state's vast GIS system to pinpoint better where there are problems with groundwater quality, particularly with the type of impacts from wineries and the nutrients and nitrate in particular. And only where that is a real issue pinpointed, not just in a region, but in a particular area, should the order be activated. So we would suggest going back and looking at whether in today's day and age, we've got the resources, and I assert we do, to think about pinpointing application of the order. You can adopt it statewide right now if the board feels that's appropriate after it's further modified. But in addition, modify it such that it's only applicable where there's a particular problem. Thank you for your time.
Thank you as well for the time and the comments. Much appreciated. That brings us to the conclusion of comments. Fellow board members, any further discussion? I know we had a bit of discussion there at the beginning, here and there peppered. The themes again I continue to hear is on the economic impacts, getting tighter numbers. It sounds like there is a desire to understand how we can be. It seems a little more tailored, we'll say, when it comes to the requirements. There is tailoring, I will say, in defense of the work. The tier structure demonstrates that. I think there are ways that we continue, obviously, need to refine. And I don't have too much more to add other than the comments that I provided previously. Looking forward to digging in a little more and ensuring that we jointly come up with numbers insofar as the costs and impacts. And I think maybe to the vice chair's recommendation, perhaps that comes after we see a little more tightening around, again, just the requirements. And again, it's a back and forth between the discretion we do want to leave to the regions for the very unique circumstances that each winery can sometimes provide itself, but provide the benefit of the certainty that we're pursuing here. And would also just note that this effort for a general order came at request by and large by many within the wine industry because of a desire to not have this patchwork of waste discharge requirements through the various regional boards, and to have a more even playing field. And then we find ourselves with COVID, and so we know we're certainly sensitive to what that means for all of our work, let alone these efforts. But appreciate everyone's engagement, though, and I think this is something that we can continue to engage on, and hopefully get it to a point here where the board feels comfortable for adoption following something of the timeline that was provided. But I think we'll have to see how further discussion amongst board members goes after this workshop and after further reflection. All that being said, I'll turn it over to my colleagues if there's anything they want to further press staff on, questions or points that they heard.
like to start with a couple of points. And first of all, just really want to thank everyone today for their comments, very thoughtful comments, and helping to guide us as we go through this process. I have been involved in this issue for a number of years and want to thank Scott and the whole team. It's been fun getting to know you all, and especially been really useful to be out on the ground at some of the tours. I felt like I learned a lot through that process, and better understood not just winery process, but also some of the challenges that many of these facilities have. Though, oftentimes we think of them as large facilities, they really and truly are the backbone of small businesses that we have in the state of California. And so I know we already talked a lot about further economic analysis and tightening up the language, but I just wanted to bring up a couple of areas that I in particular am really interested in. One is the whole issue of land application and agronomic rate, crop uptake, as opposed to irrigated lands approaches. And so that is an area that I'm anxious to hear back from some of the stakeholders to see if maybe you can help us on this. We started this process out trying to see if we could do more streamlining with stormwater permits and also irrigated lands. And that presented a lot of challenges, but that doesn't mean that we can't structure this in such a way that we maybe require something different than irrigated lands, where groundwater is at risk or under certain circumstances, and where the water quality risks are not there as much, seeing if we can be more flexible so that even though it's not truly a streamlined approach, it could be sort of looking to these other processes that the regulated community already does undertake. So that's an area I'd like to, really hear back. And then also the commingled domestic systems. Thank you, Mr. Bishop, for mentioning that that's an area that you all will be looking into, concerned mostly about systems that are already in place, especially where there's an ability to show that they're being protective of groundwater. And then I think the one area that we didn't talk a lot about, and that is the tiered structure. So as we go through and see if there are some changes that perhaps are warranted, whether it's through land application, monitoring, or what have you, in part that could be related to the tiers. And so if I would just suggest that as staff goes through making changes, if it appears that some adjustments within the tiers could help us to find that sweet spot on flexibility, then that's something that I definitely am open to. And know that tier 4 in particular, if we're looking at the larger wineries, many of those of the largest are under individual permits and would likely be continuing under individual permits. And so knowing that, areas where there would be the greatest concern, making adjustments, providing for some flexibility, even in that larger tier, perhaps could be done in such a way that we still protect groundwater quality. And then same thing on the lower end, on the de minimis side, with respect to any adjustments as far as the trigger of under 10,000 or other approaches that could be used as a way to, along with making adjustments on some of the specifics, looking at adjustments within the tiers. So just want to thank you all again, and look forward to continuing our work on this.
Thank you so much, Vice Chair.
Yeah, I completely agree with Vice Chair Diadamo's comments and suggestions, and ask staff to look into those areas where we can provide additional flexibility. And I just want to add a couple more things. And, I to thank everyone who's been involved with this. And, especially I did had a chance to go down to Temecula and tour some of the wineries down there with Mr. Bailey, one of the speakers today. And I have a very vivid image of his ponds in my mind as I'm thinking through smaller wineries in the tier 1 category and how they'll be affected by this. And so I just, there really is no substitute for being out there in the field and actually understanding, what some of these wineries possibly will have to go through in those different unique situations that they each are facing. And so, to me, it is a challenge to figure out what is that sweet spot balance of, statewide consistency with protecting water quality risk and not wanting to add undue regulatory or economic burden on our industries. That's tough, and we're trying to do that here. And so I do, in light of our, the crisis, the pandemic that we're dealing with today, and, even our limited resources and, being, yesterday our board had a discussion of our priorities for the year, and we have a very extensive list of items that we're focused on. And this is one of them, and it's certainly important, but I don't want to let the urgency of, a November adoption date necessarily get in the way of refining some of these aspects of the general order if that time is needed, to find ways to incorporate more flexibility. And in one other area, that is to understand truly a little bit better, what data do we have with all the permits that are out there with wineries in the Central Coast, with the Napa local agency program that's been going on for 20 years. It seems like we should have a fairly robust set of water quality data in our systems or maybe through the counties. And so we should understand fairly well, I hope, at least in certain areas, what have the water quality impacts been from these ongoing winery operations over decades? And in instances where there are already permits, how effective have they been? And do we need to step up the monitoring significantly in those areas if they've already made investments in their systems and are already mitigating any potential water quality risk? So I just want to flag that. It's just an area that I want to understand better. When we're talking about the tiers based on just size of the winery, I think there needs to be a little more thought as to the risk as well. That came up a number of times today, but I will look forward to seeing the data behind kind of the rationale and thinking behind the approach that we have currently. And then the other piece that came to mind is when we're looking at the economics and the costs of this permit, it's not just this permit. It's a cumulative effect, and you can look at other permits and regulatory actions from other agencies, but I think we can even look at our own. We can look at the state board and regional board and think through, what is a winery going to have to, what permits will they have to get just from us to comply with water quality regulations? And that's not just the process winery order now they'll have to get coverage under, but also perhaps, septic system permit, maybe from the county and maybe from the board. If they have commingled discharge, we have to sort out what that means. They may need a permit for industrial stormwater runoff, depending on their site-specific situations. There may be some others that I'm missing. So I think the economic analysis really needs to kind of embody all of that and really take to heart, truly what is that burden that we're laying on as regulators onto our regulated community. Not just looking at it piecemeal one at a time, but really how do all these different regulatory actions fit together? So with that, I do thank everyone who's participated today. It's been really helpful. So thank you so much, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, board member. Any other thoughts?
I guess I'll add on. So I'll reiterate the thanks to everybody. And, also just this process, many years of work on all sides, and then this is a continued step in that. that helps us to, you know, really fine tune and hit this balancing that we need to do to ensure that we're protecting water quality and the beneficial users of that water. You know, I think I mentioned before so those that know me know I care deeply about groundwater quality and groundwater data and monitoring. And I think that, you know, we absolutely need to both characterize, you know, our water, our receiving waters really in groundwater quality, and also understand the risk to that in waste discharge. You know, I also think, as we discussed, that really needs to be tailored to fit the risk, and especially in terms of ongoing monitoring. You know, I think characterizing that and ensuring that we're certainly using all existing data. We should be reducing costs and minimizing those costs, which can be extreme, especially if you're needing to install like a monitoring well or something that's much more expensive. It seems like what I heard from staff is and stakeholders is that there's some of that ability to tailor it already, but there's interest in really tightening that up and clarifying that. Similarly, and then just also on that, I feel pretty strongly that, you know, in the interest of the state and frankly, all dischargers and beneficial users, we should be making groundwater monitoring data all submitted electronically into our GeoTracker database, because I think that helps, as Board Member McGuire said, us all utilize existing data rather than having to recreate and I think, you know, we absolutely need to characterize water quality in our state to understand impacts. I think my other kind of issue that I have frustrations around a lot is, you know, trying to ensure that our regulations are not kind of just consultant employment programs to generate a lot of reports and have to require a lot of expense to hire consultants to develop studies, but that it's really, you know, to the extent we can ensure that we're focused on performance outcomes. And I think what I heard from staff is, you know, continuing to tighten up how we, there might be, you know, flexibility to utilize those studies as a way to address site-specific needs or designs. But I think trying to minimize the need to do additional, you know, studies, documents, plans that require a lot of costs and engineers and consultants and may not result in the kind of changes and protections that ultimately all of us want to see. Similarly, I really appreciated the local agencies' reminders and comments that, you know, we're setting forth expectations for local agency oversight and implementation. And I think we should hold ourselves to those same standards in terms of inspections and, you know, reviewing the kind of oversight and, you know, how that's spelled out is, you know, isn't clear to me, it sounds like, but, and local agencies would like that more, but I think that's a very valid point to bring up. And then just overall, I think with local agencies, we really do want to encourage and allow for local agencies to step up to administer these sorts of programs. I think we recognize that there's, you know, a lot of benefits on that on many sides. And then I think we also need to ensure that we're able to be a backstop on water quality, you know, within this as well. So we want to retain that ability, while also, recognizing the importance of local programs in helping us all implement. Lastly, I think, we've had conversations yesterday and today around economic impact, a lot of discussion today. I, share the board members' concerns or frustrations with the way that we piecemeal, our regulations and permits and the economic analysis. I also just, think it's important to point out that there are real costs on, beneficial users in terms of allowing impacts. And so, it's hard for us to quantify and balance all of these things on all sides. But I think just as we need to really minimize economic impacts to the regulated community, which I think we absolutely need to do and sort of look at that holistically, I also think we need to look at, the also very real economic impacts that, beneficial users have of the waters, whether it's surface water or groundwater that folks utilize for many different, whether it's business, residential, or agriculture or environmental uses. So yeah, I think those are my main points, just of how I'm thinking about this. I really do think that it's incredibly helpful. We rely on stakeholders of, all of you that were, part of this effort today and continuing to provide comments to help us, really tailor things and continue to iterate on this. So I just look forward to really constructive work and, both from staff and stakeholders to help us, get to a program we can adopt. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Board Member. Board Member Dodek.
Thank you. Thank you for all the comments, and thank you to all the stakeholders who provided their input today. And a huge thank you to the staff. I mean, this has been a tremendous effort that has gone on for now 5 years. And I think it really reflects the challenge of developing a statewide order for a complex regulated community like wineries, and also addressing the many different site-specific issues, not to mention economics and everything else that must be considered. And one of the things that always concerns me when we look at things doing things on a statewide basis, one is how do we do that and ensure that the quality level of the permit is just simply not the lowest common denominator, but actually adds value that provides consistency, but at the same time sets a real realistic yet high quality level that we can all achieve together and move forward on water quality. So that that balance that I think all the board members have spoken of today is so complicated because of that. And on this particular order, I'm also mindful that we have regional boards who have delayed their water quality protection activities, awaiting our action on this matter. And it seems like every year the bar keeps moving in terms of when we might act. We've seen this in other statewide orders as well. I will have to confess, during my time on the board, and while there is obviously very legitimate reasons and very difficult, complicated issues that we have to consider and balance in making these decisions, I think I personally feel that I'm personally mindful of the fact that we have basically wrestled this out of the regional board's hand, and therefore we have an obligation to move forward efficiently, obviously effectively and deliberately, but also move this to an action point at some time. In addition to looking forward to reading the written comment letters that will come in, I guess a heads up to John Bishop and Scott Couch and some of the staff that I also plan to reach out to some of the regional water boards. I know from being liaison for Region 2, the San Francisco Regional Water Board, that they've been very eager to address water quality issues coming from winery. And obviously there's the San Diego region, the Central Coast region, the Central Valley region. So I'm also interested in hearing what they have to say in terms of the remaining issues, but also perhaps more concerning to me is what staff proposing adequate to meet their needs, since after all, again, we're trying to provide statewide consistency in a way that furthers water quality protection, both for surface as well as obviously groundwater. So thank you all. I know there's more work to come on this, and I look forward to engaging with the stakeholders, the staff, and also the regional boards.
Thank you, board members. Great points all around. Again, also just echo the thanks once over again for the great participation today, the good comments and discussion. Again, I think there's room for follow-up. We'll be looking to follow up with staff. Look forward to the written comments. There, I think again, August 5th, I believe is our deadline. So do try to get those in timely. And can I just double check? Is it August 5th? Hold on, I have my notes here. Mr. Couch, you can just probably remind me.
August 5th at noon.
Okay. At noon, yes. Okay. Those few hours in the morning, they may prove to be critical for some. So noon it is on the 5th, August 5th. Thank you. Anything that you heard, Mr. Couch, now that you're here, from board members or otherwise in the comments today that would be helpful, you think, to clarify, to leave us with?
Well, I will second board member McGuire's some of his comments in terms of the field trips that we took to Temecula. I've got except for Shala and myself, I've got a brand new team who didn't go on any of these trips. And so I vividly remember the ones in Temecula with the small crush pad and the one pipe and the infiltration basins there. And I'm trying to explain that to staff about how small that operation was and what they were doing. And I can see the kind of blank looks of, you have a picture in your mind of a big giant winery in the valley, but they're all shapes and sizes. They have all different types of operations. And so we had big plans to do an additional couple of trips if the vintners would have us there, but the COVID thing came up and the travel stopped. And so we didn't have that opportunity with the new staff that have taken on this project. So at some point, maybe we will get to do that again. But I think it was a valuable experience, and I appreciate the folks that invited us onto their properties to see what kind of operations that they had. And that's also why a statewide order is very hard.
No, it is incredibly difficult, and appreciate just the ongoing engagement and discussion that helps refine to that point of balancing, and just thank you, Mr. Couch. Mr. Bishop and also Mr. Regan, did either of you, would you like to leave us with some thoughts as well? I'll quickly flag though, Mr. John Nagel has joined us back in the Zoom platform. So Mr. Nagel, if you do wish to go ahead and still provide some comment here, we have time, just raise your hand. And then, so we'll give you a moment, and then otherwise can kick it over to Mr. Bishop for comment. Oh, yes, Mr. Nagel.
Well, thank you. I don't have any comments. Unfortunately, I had some other pressing business, and I did not get to hear everybody's comment. I don't want to be repeating something that may have already been said. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's fair. And if there's, even if it is repeating, if there's anything you wanted to make sure you left us with, do feel free. But then otherwise, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us. And sorry we weren't able to get to you timely earlier. But thank you still yet. And written public comment is also open. So look forward to perhaps your comments through that as well. Thank you, Mr. Nagel.
You're welcome.
Yes, Chair Estevall, I just wanted to take a moment to thank all the board members for their flagging of issues. It makes it, that is the purpose of these workshops. It focuses our effort when we're looking at the comments. It gives us a starting point. We will be reviewing lots of comments, I expect, very technical comments, some very big policy comments. I did get some overarching themes from this that I wanted to reiterate and make sure that folks agreed, if I was off base, that we need to be looking at the economics associated with the different tiers and the different sizes of wineries. We need to be evaluating the risk associated with the discharge and tailoring our requirements as much as possible to those risks. We need to be looking at the technical reports and ensuring that those are only required where they're essential and where they serve a purpose of addressing either a water quality issue or a need to evaluate an exemption to other requirements. I would make one caution that there was a lot of discussion about GeoTracker and all of our groundwater monitoring. What we found in almost every instance that that gives you a general understanding of the groundwater and primarily the deep groundwater, and doesn't give you really much information about the shallow groundwater or the specific areas of concern. And to be blunt, the reason that is that we have lots of discharges that don't monitor groundwater. So we don't know what the groundwater is associated with shallow discharges. We will evaluate that and look at what we have associated with wineries. We will look at effluent data to evaluate how that compares to water quality standards. I'm very encouraged by what I heard today that that it may be that a number of wineries are meeting water quality standards, which case we will evaluate how do we recognize that so that we're focusing the costs and efforts on folks that are not meeting water quality standards at their effluent. And those are kind of the big themes I heard, and just wanted to summarize them.
Really good summary. Thank you, Mr. Bishop. It's what I heard in common amongst our considerations as well. So thank you. And I would just note, the economic impact and better analysis and understanding, the complexity of, what are the impacts of not just the costs to regulated entities here, but the benefits. And we're, always trying to do better there. I know, to my mind, it brings up the economic feasibility work in the context of the Division of Drinking Water and our MCLs that we're trying to always do. And then would also just remind us then as well that we really don't have dedicated economic staff or a unit that is really able to infuse these resources. And we're trying to do, and I think we'll continue to need to make sure we focus on doing better about programmatizing, systematizing some of that work, its approach, the tools that can be used and repurposed throughout the programs and divisions. So appreciate that and appreciate that we need to continue to work on it. Any other comments from folks? Mr. Regan, I see you here. Would you like to
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, we heard today a few times that there's really no basis for the order because we haven't seen any evidence of groundwater pollution. And the board's challenge when issuing WDRs is to come up with an order that looks at the nature of the discharge and develop requirements to prevent that pollution from happening in the first place, not to wait till it's observed and then react to it. The court in the Agua case, the dairy case, pointed out that looking at regional, deeper groundwater monitoring wells is really invalid in terms of evaluating the impacts from any particular facility, and that it's almost too late at that point. You're then in the groundwater remediation realm. So just wanted to clarify that.
That's appreciated. Thank you. Okay, well, I have no further comment other than, again, repeated thanks for everyone's good time and attention today. And Mr. Loffer would provide you the opportunity to let me know if there's anything further we should consider. Otherwise, what we'll be doing is going into a closed session on a personnel item. Let's give board members about 30 minutes before we go into closed session. Otherwise, that concludes this public workshop. And then, Mr. Loffer will put in the official end time for the board meeting after we finish up with our closed session. But that concludes this public workshop and discussion. And just thank you, everyone. Again, really appreciate it. And fellow board members, we will reconvene for our closed session at 1:15. Or you know what? Do we want to give ourselves a little more time? Do I just want 1:30? Does that work for everyone?
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, 1:30 it is. We will convene in closed session. Thank you again, everyone, and see you soon.